Chapter 27. Riding the camel back to the gathering place. Dean and others immediately saw that the desolate sand was densely packed with figures of different heights. There were other students who participated in the assessment. Although the overall number was much smaller than before, it was still very impressive. So many people are qualified. Mason was surprised. Dean was also a little surprised, but soon he was relieved. Although the children who were recruited here came from different families, but under Tobu's collective training, whether they were delicate or weak, all of them had transformed into a brand new person. There was not much difference in the physique of everyone, although the first and last place were separated by hundreds of ranks, but in terms of performance, the difference was only a few minutes. Moreover, in this desert survival assessment, endurance was only a supporting role. The real help to survival was to rely on the brain and luck. I didn't expect that there would be so many powerful people. Mason, Zach and Sham said with emotion, I thought that we were hard-working enough, but I didn't expect others to be the same. The other children were also a little surprised. In these 10 days of survival in the desert, everyone had experienced the difficulty of survival. They had thought that it was already a miracle that they could stubbornly survive in such a hopeless situation. They did not expect that there were so many people who could create miracles like them. At that moment, everyone realized that they were definitely not the most special one in this world. If they wanted to get attention, it was nothing to rely on their current efforts. They had to work 10 times or even 100 times harder to get it. The sun was setting. With the return of the last camel, all the people who had successfully passed the assessment had arrived. At this time, a huge black carriage came and stopped in front of everyone. 2 people jumped out of the carriage. They were Tobu and Chris. After they got off the carriage, they turned around and opened the curtain. They only heard the jingling sound of chains, and then a distorted figure was pushed out of the carriage and fell on the sand. Tobu and Chris didn't have the slightest politeness. They roughly pulled the man's chain and brought him in front of all the children. In an instant, the whole sand was silent. Dean's pupils suddenly shrank when he saw the figure. His fingers and his sleeves clenched nervously. His back was drenched in cold sweat. He saw the figure wrapped in chains. It was an alchemist. What's more, he and the hunchbacked old man he killed were the same life alchemy warlocks, and they both used their own bodies for experiments. Moreover, the after effects of this person's experiment were even more exaggerated. On his tall and sturdy body, a twisting snake tail grew out from his buttocks, wrapping around his body. His face was covered in lumps of flesh, and on his left wrist, a bone dagger that looked like a curved blade protruded. It was extremely sharp, but the most shocking thing was that his chest actually split open from the center, and from the crack, sharp fangs could vaguely be seen. He could no longer be called a human. Everyone was dumbfounded. The children who had never seen an alchemist widened their eyes and looked at such a monster in disbelief. Tobu looked around at everyone, indifferently smiled, and said, First of all, I want to congratulate you for passing the survival assessment. You can continue to be ravaged by me for 6 months. Secondly, there are some things you should also know. With that, he stepped on the back of the tall and sturdy figure wrapped in chains and kicked him to the ground. This is the alchemist that your parents often told you about, the devil's apostle. All the children burst into an uproar. They didn't expect that the devil that they had heard about since childhood actually existed and appeared in front of them. Suddenly, all kinds of evil legends about the alchemist emerged in their minds. Each of them was chilling, and the twisted body in front of them also confirmed this point. This is the incarnation of the devil. This time, there was an alchemist lurking in the assessment place, causing a lot of people to be accidentally eliminated. At this time, Chris stood up. Her wheat-colored face showed a faint smile, but fortunately there were no casualties. What is worth congratulating is that after encountering the alchemist, many people not only were not frightened, but also rose up to resist and cooperated with the Knights of Light to subdue the alchemist. She raised her hand and pointed to the alchemist that Tobu was stepping on. This is a student called Lorian. He cooperated with the Knights of Light and subdued the alchemist last night. He hasn't been judged by the light yet. Hearing her words, All the children were once again in an uproar, full of amazement and excitement. Although the Knights of Light were not affiliated with the military, but they were the exclusive knights of the Holy Church. They symbolized noble character and pure will. Even the nobles were proud to be able to marry a Knight of Light. There is actually a Knight of Light. I didn't expect that among us there would be such a powerful person who can help the Knights of Light to capture the devil. Too happy if I can meet a Knight of Light. I really want to see what they look like. Mason, Sham, and Zach said with emotion. When the other children heard Chris' words, they were full of envy. To be able to help the Knights of Light to punish the devil, just thinking about it made them excited and excited. Chris smiled and said, "In this incident, a total of 38 people were attacked by the alchemists, but 17 of them did not surrender to the demons. Instead, they delayed until the arrival of the Knights of Light. Especially Lorien last night. Not only did he survive the attacks of the alchemists, but he also secretly left a signal which allowed the Knights of Light to track him down and capture him in one fell swoop. Such fearlessness in the face of danger, calm and courageous character, is worth learning by all. Here, I announce that all the candidates who assisted the Knights of Light to subdue the alchemist will be rewarded with a second-class military merit. This military merit will be recorded in your household register. In the future, when you become a guard, you will be directly promoted to the rank of captain and get the right to apply to become a knight. The knight referred to the knights of the military establishment. Hearing her words, everyone could not help but be envious, and their eyes were red. Knights and guards were two completely different levels. Although the knights of the military and the exclusive Knights of Light of the Holy Church could not be compared, but they were also the object of the aristocracy. Even a civilian knew that the status of a knight was almost the highest achievement that a civilian could achieve. Their status was only slightly inferior to the aristocracy. As for the commander of the knights, their status was higher than that of the aristocracy. As for the commander of the knights, it was needless to say that they stood at the top of the knights. In addition to what we already know, 10 days ago at the secret stronghold of the alchemist, the Knights of Light found a few footprints. According to their speculation, someone was caught by the alchemist, but managed to escape. I don't know who it was, but please stand up and let me record your military merit. Chris suddenly smiled. Hearing this, everyone was surprised and looked at each other. Dean's heart tightened. He immediately saw Zach, Mason, and Sham looking at him. Only the three of them knew that he had escaped from the alchemist. Dean's heart sank as he looked at the envy and excitement in the eyes of the three. He knew that most of his footprints had been traced by the Knights of Light. But because of the long time gap, he had deliberately covered up the remaining footprints after Zach reminded him. So he didn't catch up at that time. When he killed the alchemist, he did not think about covering his tracks because he did not expect that the Knights of Light would appear. Later, he covered up the footprints to deal with Zach. At the moment, he thought that he was lucky. If he did not cover up the footprints in time, he was afraid that the Knights of Light would have already caught up with him. He had the alchemy notes tied to his trousers. If he was found out, he did not need to think about how big of a crime it would be. Chapter 28. Although Chris said that the reward was extremely tempting, but Dean rationally dismissed the idea of claiming it. He was not sure if the Knights of Light had found any clues about him from the alchemist's chamber, although he had burned the place, but the traces of the explosion would not disappear. If he was brought to the Knights of Light for questioning after receiving the reward, it would be inevitable that flaws would be exposed. Moreover, he had the alchemy notes in his trousers. Once it was found out, the consequences would be unimaginable. He just wanted to stay as far away from the Knights of Light as possible. He couldn't help but wryly smile. If he knew that it would be like this, he wouldn't have kept the notes. If that was the case, he could go to claim the military merit and make up a reason to escape. Maybe he could fool them. Knight's opportunity. Dean sighed in his heart. There was some pain, but he still gritted his teeth and gave up the idea. Dean, that's great. Zach was excited. He wanted to continue, but was stopped by Dean's stern eyes. Zach, Mason, and Shaw were surprised for a moment. But after a few months of getting along and 10 days of survival training, they had a tacit understanding of Dean's meaning. However, Their hearts were full of doubts. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It could be said that a golden road to the highest civilian status symbol had been sent to Dean's feet. He only needed to take a step forward. This was something that many people yearned for in their dreams. However, under Dean's gaze, the three of them looked at each other and didn't say anything. During this period of time, they had long been convinced by Dean. Although it was inconceivable and doubtful, they still didn't stop Dean's choice. Chris saw that there was no response from the crowd. She couldn't help but frown. At this moment, a voice sounded, "Me, it's me." It was a short boy. He raised his hand and looked nervous. Chris breathed a sigh of relief, deeply looked at him, and smiled. "Congratulations, Instructor Tobu will record the reward in your household register. Now, let us appreciate how the Knights of Light punish the devil." As soon as she finished speaking, a person slowly stepped out of the giant black carriage. It was a young man dressed in silver-white armor. He had a handsome appearance and a tall and straight figure. As he walked, his armor creaked softly, giving off a pleasant sound. It was full of charm. All the children's eyes were filled with excitement. Compared to the arrogant nobles, the commoners worshipped the righteous and benevolent Radiant Knights more. Dean looked at the young Knight of Light. He was thinking about the previous matter. Was the alchemist that Chris was talking about not the one he had met? Or could it be that the short kid was pretending to be him? No matter which one it was, Crazy didn't seem to have any intention of verifying it. She believed him just because he admitted it. This made him feel a little regretful. If he had known it would be so simple, he would have claimed it. He also blamed himself for thinking too much. He sighed inwardly and collected his thoughts. No matter what, he only had one life, and it was always right to be cautious. As for the military merits, he shook his head and cast these thoughts aside. At this time, the young Knight of Light had arrived in front of the alchemist. There was a faint smile on his face. He slowly pulled out the knight's sword from his waist and raised it high. The sunlight reflected on the blade of the sword. "I, Melk, in the name of the God of Light, sentence the devil. Light will eventually expel all darkness." He softly chanted. The sword in his hand suddenly slashed down. With a puff, the head of the dying alchemist was suddenly cut off. Blood gushed out from his neck. His body fell to the ground, and blood gurgled into the sand. Such a bloody scene made many children take a step back in fear. But soon they became excited again. They shouted the words on the cover of the holy book, "Light will eventually expel all darkness." The voices rose and fell, gradually becoming uniform and reverberating throughout the entire desert. Dean didn't want to be found strange, so he also softly shouted. But in his heart, he silently said, "Can't you see that the blood of that human is as red as yours?" In this world, public trials of criminals were very common. Whenever the magistrate sentenced the most heinous criminals, it would attract countless people to watch. Perhaps in this monotonous world of entertainment, this was also a kind of lively. Soon, the Knight of Light, named Melk, finished the trial of the alchemist. He wiped his sword and turned away. Dean and the other children were escorted by Chris and Tobu. They were dragged back to the scavenger training ground in a black carriage. After returning to the dormitory, everyone felt that this small room that had once looked shabby was actually so warm and reliable. I heard that a total of 8 alchemists were arrested this time. Dasha leaned on the soft chair and said with a smile, "This is a merit that even I am jealous of. You're the one who cooperates in this operation, so you can also get a share. I believe that after this batch of special training is over, you will be promoted to the Hunter School. At that time, when the time comes to discipline those monsters, you will have to suffer a lot." Tobu smiled bitterly. "You must be joking. This is just a drizzle for you." The main credit goes to the genius of Mel family. Today, he publicly sentenced a 2-star alchemist. It seems that the Mel family is going to rise again. Dasha's mouth showed a trace of a smile. "I heard that a 3-star alchemist was killed by another alchemist, and a child escaped from him." "Yes," Tobu sighed. "The child has been taken by Chris for interrogation. She should be able to find some clues. The person who was able to kill a 3-star alchemist is also an alchemist." According to the Knight of Light, the scene was destroyed by the power of the devil. I hope it is not a four-star alchemist. Dasha narrowed her eyes. Four-star alchemists have not been active in the desert for a long time. If there was a four-star alchemist in the desert, then I guess you and the Knights of Light wouldn't be able to come back. Tobu took a deep breath and said, "The next time there is such a thing, I hope you can inform me in advance so that I won't be kept in the dark again." Dashani yawned and said, "I'm tired. You can go back to work first." Tobu slightly smiled and respectfully retreated. Giant Wall Calendar Year 291, Rainy Season. The experiment is ready. I have completely mastered the structure of the human body. Today, I will use my own body for the experiment. Soon, my name, Rosyard, will be forever engraved in the Alchemy Palace. I will become the new creator. Chapter 29. Failed. Why is it like this? The nerves and blood vessels are connected. The implantation should be successful. Why didn't I get the same power as the Knight of Light? Dean suddenly thought of Rosyard's mutated shoulder. From the experimental records, it was obvious that the implantation had failed. However, the words "the same power as the Knight of Light" surprised Dean. Was the purpose of Rosyard's experiment to turn himself into a Knight of Light? No. To be precise, it was to have the same power as the Knight of Light. Didn't it mean that the Knight of Light would have the power beyond ordinary people through genetic modification? This was definitely an explosive piece of news. It should be known that genetic modification is an evil technique used by alchemists. If the Knights of Light are also like this, then the Holy Church behind them is an extremely terrible existence. Dean's eyes were full of doubt, but he continued to read. The latter part of the diary recorded Rosyard's experimental experience for more than a decade. After the failure of the experiment, Rosyard became cautious. Every time the experiment progressed to success, he would find human children as experimental subjects. Once the experiment was successful, he would kill the child. Then he would post the results of the experiment to the Dark Church to get alchemy merits. Once the merits accumulated to a certain level, they would be able to upgrade their alchemy level. They would be certified to a higher level and get greater rights and resources. According to Rosyard's diary, the Dark Church was a huge force composed of alchemists, potioneers, dark puppeteers, and other heterodox professions. They were lurking everywhere in the Giant Wall. The members of the Dark Church were nobles and poor people. Even the army was infiltrated by the Dark Church. If the Holy Church was a behemoth standing proudly in the sun, then the Dark Church was a terrible monster lurking in the night. Holy Church, Dark Church, Giant Wall, military. Dean murmured. At present, these three forces were in a tripartite situation in the Giant Wall. The mysterious magistrate seemed to be detached. He didn't know whether it belonged to the Giant Wall military or the Holy Church, but at least it didn't belong to the Dark Church. I know too little. Dean sighed. He was at a loss as he didn't know where to go in the future. He couldn't stand the restrictions if he surrendered to the Giant Wall military. He couldn't abandon his faith if he joined the Holy Church. He couldn't face his conscience if he joined the Dark Church. From the notes, it could be seen that the various professions of the Dark Church were the same as the scientists of different fields in the old era. However, a group of scientists without laws and moral constraints were no different from the devils. Dean could not help but feel that it was as difficult as ascending to the sky to climb to the top of the world from a nobody. Even an idea suddenly emerged in his mind. It seemed to be good to live in such an ordinary way. He thought of the noble girl's sharp words, Anjura, and her husband's humble attitude in front of the nobles. He also remembered that he almost lost his life in the castle. He gently closed his eyes and asked himself in his heart, "Can I survive if I'm ordinary? Would he be able to avoid disaster just because he was humble? No, I can't." When one's life was threatened, being ordinary and petty would only make one even more powerless to resist. He slowly opened his eyes. His eyes were unprecedentedly firm. Even if he had to sacrifice his freedom, even if he had to abandon his faith, even if he had to abandon mercy, he had to live well. Even if he had to crawl in the dark quagmire, he had to dig out his own light. He grabbed the iron sheet on the table and cut his arm. There was a finger-long, bright red wound. The pain made him slightly clench his teeth, but his eyes became colder and colder. He secretly said, Dean, it's just because of the difficulty that you have given birth to such a cowardly idea. How can you face your parents? How can you face your sister? You have taken up the only chance to survive. He clenched his teeth as he looked at the blood flowing from his arm. The pain eroded his brain. He clenched his fists as if to firmly remember the pain. He silently warned himself that no matter what difficulties he would encounter in the future, he would never change his direction. He would never let the world tame him. Mason and others came back and saw the blood flowing from Dean's arm. They were shocked and quickly sent him to bandage. The scavenger training continued. Time flew. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. Dean, the special training is finally over. Today is the coronation ceremony. Finally, we can go home to see our parents. Zach laughed. He was a filial son in the dormitory. Every month he would go back to see his parents. Dean, Mason, and Sham would only visit occasionally. Usually, they would write letters to their parents so that they would not worry about them. Dean smiled. After 3 years, his appearance had changed a lot. His skin was not as white as before. Instead, it was a healthy wheat color. His height was about 1.6 meters. Compared to his peers, he was very tall. After all, he was only 12 years old this year. Hey, our dormitory should be the most special one. All 4 of us stayed. Mason grinned, revealing 2 rows of white teeth, full of sunshine and hearty. Sham was tidying up his clothes. He looked up and smiled. I hope that after we enter the military, we could be assigned together. If we are separated, remember to come to my family's tavern to play. I'll treat you. Dean and the other 2 had already heard the address of his family's tavern. Mason laughed and said, I will definitely drink your family's money. They laughed. At this time, all of them had finished packing up their luggage. Dean said, Let's go. It's getting late. Let's go to the drill ground. The 4 of them went out and came to the huge drill ground. There were dozens of figures chatting. Mason sighed. 3 years ago, there were more than 300 people. I didn't expect that now there are only so few left. Gee, it's really lucky that the 4 of us can graduate together. There are still people who haven't come. Sham shrugged. I've already calculated that the number of graduates is 106. Zach looked at the woods outside the drill ground. How come old Tobu brought so many people? Are they here for the coronation ceremony? Dean and the others looked and saw Tobu and 7 or 8 people coming together. They were talking and laughing along the way. These 7 or 8 people were dressed in bright clothes and had elegant manners. At first glance, they knew that they were nobles or servants who had been influenced by noble etiquette. Chapter 30. After a moment, all the people had arrived. Hundreds of figures stood neatly on the drill ground. Tobu said to the 8 adults, Everyone, wait a minute. He came to the front of the crowd. There was a rare smile on his cold face. First of all, congratulations on finally standing out from the garbage and becoming a qualified soldier. However, the real test will begin from now on. From now on, you will leave this warm cradle and face the real life and death. Everyone was slightly surprised. Some did not understand the meaning of Tobu's words. Dean's eyes lit up. He knew that Tobu was going to announce the identity of scavengers. As he expected, Tobu looked at everyone's puzzled expression and said in a clear voice, From the moment you graduate, you will get a new identity. But you will not be a guard as you think, but a scavenger. Scavengers? Everyone looked at each other. I know that many of you are hearing about this position for the first time. Tobu slowly said, Let me put it bluntly. Scavengers are higher than guards and are on the same level as knights. However, knights are loyal to the core and nobles. In my opinion, they are just a group of small white faces. Scavengers are the real warriors who create wealth and protect human beings. Everyone's eyes widened. The same level as knights? What kind of illustrious identity was that? Suddenly, everyone felt like they were dreaming. They did not expect that 3 years of hard work and persistence would get such a generous return. Tobu looked at the excitement on everyone's face and calmly said, But the difference between scavengers and knights is that one is in the dark and the other is in the light. In short, scavengers are the heroes behind the scenes. From today on, your identity as scavengers can't be disclosed even to your parents or loved ones. This is a military secret. Outside, we will give you the identity of a guard to cover up. After you have accumulated enough military merits, you can get permanent residence in the commercial district. Hearing Tobu's words, everyone's eyes blazed. Living in the commercial district was the wish of almost every civilian in the residential district. Instructor, what is the job of scavengers? At this time, a dark-skinned teenager raised his hand and asked. Tobu indifferently said, your job is to go to the safe area outside the giant wall, collect all the information and resources outside the giant wall, and bring them back here. All the children were in an uproar. They realized that there was no free lunch in the world. Although no one had seen the world outside the giant wall, but they were indoctrinated from an early age. They were full of awe for the giant wall. This was a deep-rooted fear. But now they had to step out of the giant wall and go to the forbidden area. Instructor, can we withdraw? Someone raised his hand weakly. Tobu indifferently said, yes, but I will give your family compensation in the name of death in the line of duty. Everyone felt a chill in their hearts. This was a position with no choice. You don't have to worry, although it is very dangerous outside the giant wall, but we will not waste 3 years of resources to cultivate some cannon fodder. You work in a safe area that has been cleaned. As long as you are careful, there will be no danger. The death rate of scavengers is not high. Tobu looked at the crowd and said, moreover, when you go outside the giant wall, you will get God's blessing. God's blessing? Everyone was stunned. Dean could not help but raise his eyebrows. Tobu pointed to the 8 figures next to him and said, these 8 are representatives of the 7 consortiums of the commercial district and military. You can choose to join any of them. From now on, you will work for the consortium or the military of your choice. You will collect resources from outside the giant wall. You can exchange them for huge wealth. I remember there was a scavenger who picked up a strange object outside the giant wall. He got 100,000 gold coins and became a rich man. Everyone's heart was fiercely shocked. 100,000 gold coins? This was a wealth that they could not even imagine. Dean's eyes flashed. He did not expect that scavengers could get a commission from the things they picked up. It seemed that it was a good career to get rich. However, the easier it was to get rich, the higher the risk. At this time, the 8 men and women came to the front of the crowd. A youth in black leather armor on the left smiled. I represent the military. This is the contract reward we give. All the people who join our military will get the qualification to live in the commercial district after 10 years. We are the Sterling Consortium. We can provide the qualification to live in the commercial district as well as houses in the bustling area. Moreover, our commission is 10%. Another graceful woman smiled. The others also opened their mouths and introduced the treatment of their consortiums. Dean understood that Tobu was just a special training center. All the children selected from the residential district would be sent here for collective special training. The forces behind this special training center were the 7 consortiums and the military. Relying on the military alone, it was impossible to force students from the residential schools. After all, some of the schools were founded by nobles or under the banner of a consortium. What made him feel strange was that there was no intervention from the Holy Church. At this time, the other children had come in front of the representatives of the consortiums and the military to choose their future path. The conditions given by these consortiums were similar. Because of the competition, the benefits given were not much different. Dean, let's choose the same consortium. Macon said. Dean nodded slightly. Sham asked, should we choose the military or the consortium? You should first look at the conditions given by them. Dean came in front of Tobu and said, Instructor, can we not choose all the consortiums and the military? Tobu looked down at him. He had a very deep impression of this child. Whether it was the tenacious endurance training when he first came or the rapid progress later, as well as the last 3 years, the performance of this child made him look at him in a new light. Tobu smiled and said, If you don't choose, then it is equivalent to quitting. You have good qualifications. I believe that you can mix in scavengers. Seize the opportunity. He paused for a moment and said, I can give you a personal suggestion. Melon Consortium has great potential. Dean was surprised. He didn't expect that Tobu would not recommend the military, but the consortium. Seeing Tobu turn away, he didn't catch up and ask. At this time, Sham, Mason, and Zach came back. Sham said, I saw that the conditions are almost the same. The military has the best treatment, but the materials are picked up and the commission is not high. Moreover, the conditions given by these consortiums vary from person to person. I saw Lorien joined the Sterling Consortium. The other party actually gave 15% of the extraction fee and said that he would get a blessing from God once a month. At this time, a low roar sounded. Chapter 31. It's Lorien. Macon was surprised. What is he doing? While he was in doubt, Lorien suddenly let out a loud roar. A faint redness emerged on the dark skin of his entire body, and a large amount of hot sweat emerged from his trembling muscles, bringing with it a faint stench. Along with this roar, Lorien recovered. The taut muscles of his body gradually relaxed, and the blue veins on his body also disappeared. He let out a long breath and looked down at his palms. There was some surprise on his face. Suddenly, he squatted down and tried to jump. Whoosh! He jumped 2 meters high, not the top of his head, but the soles of his feet were 2 meters above the ground. The audience was silent for a moment. Everyone looked at him in shock, their faces full of disbelief. After 3 years of hard training in the special training ground, although everyone's physical fitness was much better than their peers, there was still a limit. Wanting to jump 2 meters from where they stood was simply a fool's dream. But Lorien did it. Dean's pupil shrank. This was almost the limit of the athletes in the old era. It was not something that an average person could reach. Moreover, although Lorien's performance in the 3 years of training was very good, but it was far from such extraordinary physical fitness. Is this the blessing of God? Dean muttered to himself. When Sham heard his words, he was stunned. What? At this time, the graceful woman smiled at the surprised Lorien and said, This is God's blessing. From now on, you will get a chance to bless once a month. I hope you will work hard and use the power God has given you to create more wealth for mankind. Lorien was excited. He knelt on one knee and respectfully said, Lorien swears to be loyal to Father. The graceful woman smiled and lifted him up. She looked at the others. Anyone who joins the Sterling Consortium will get the blessing of God. Hearing her words, the other children had already understood that Lorien's sudden extraordinary power was a blessing from God. For a moment, all the children were ready to move. Nori, aren't you being unkind? Another slender man raised his eyebrows. Bringing the blessing here is not a fair competition, right? The graceful woman smiled. The rules didn't say that we can't bring it. The man could only coldly snort. Everyone who joins our green consortium will also get the blessing of God. After signing the agreement, you can go back to the consortium to receive it. Don't worry. Hearing this, many children were relieved, but there were still some children who hesitated and moved to the front of the Sterling Consortium. At this time, there was another low roar. They saw a short boy standing in front of Nori. His whole body was bulging. His appearance was similar to the previous Lorien. After a moment, the abnormality was restored. He also jumped to a height of 2 meters. The surrounding people were amazed. But thinking that they would have such extraordinary strength, they were excited. Dean's pupil shrank. The shock in his heart was even stronger than before. This time he saw clearly that the God's blessing that the woman named Noni had mentioned was actually an old-fashioned syringe. The syringe was filled with pink liquid, like diluted blood. It was she who injected this liquid into the boy's arm, causing the latter's physical strength to soar. This was not the blessing of God. It was clearly like a genetic potion. The reason why Dean was shocked was not because they called the genetic potion God's blessing, but with the technology of this era, how could it be possible to produce such a significant effect of genetic potion? One must know that the extraction of genes was already at the microscopic level of technology. There was no microscope, no electricity, no precision instruments. How could it be done? Wait, she said God's blessing. Could it be that this is something from the Radiant Church? Dean's heart shivered. He always felt that the Holy Church held unknown secrets, and it was likely to be related to 300 years ago. Perhaps this gene extraction technology was one of the secrets of the Holy Church. Amazing, worthy of the blessing of God. I don't know how long this power can last. Mason, Zach, and Sham were excited. Anyone who thought that they would soon have the power beyond ordinary people would be excited. Dean was worried as he heard their words. He only hoped that the side effects of the genetic potion wouldn't be too big. He had seen Roseyard's Life School of Alchemy. He felt that this genetic potion should be regarded as a kind of life school of alchemy. Only when the exact same thing appeared in the hands of the Radiant Church, it was lawful and just. Look, it's Bayway. She chose the Melon Consortium. At this time, Zach and Sham suddenly called out. They pointed to a girl in front of an elegant man. The girl was about 11 or 12 years old. Her skin was white, her figure was tall, and her chest was slightly bulging. Although it was still budding, but it was enough to catch the eyes of many boys. The most attractive thing was her appearance. She had delicate oval cheeks, extremely beautiful and gentle. Mason's face turned red. What are you screaming about? Zach laughed. Don't pretend to be shy. Don't you always like her? Macon stared at him and said, Lower your voice. Do you want me to strangle you? Gee, you haven't even started, and you're already paying more attention to your lover than your friend. Zach looked at him with contempt. Dean smiled. Bayway should be one of the most eye-catching girls in the special training. Mason secretly liked her. He didn't expect to choose the Melon Consortium. He thought of Tobu's words and said, Let's choose the Melon Consortium. Sham was shocked. Really? Dean is spoiling you. Zach shook his head. Mason's face was red as he looked at Dean with gratitude. Dean smiled and took the lead to line up to sign up. Soon it was their turn. Are you Dean? The elegant man seemed to recognize Dean. There was a trace of a kind smile on his face. I have seen your information. Your results are very good. You are first in endurance and comprehensive survival knowledge. You have also performed quite well in several exams, especially in the assessment a year ago. The second place found 4 items. That was very good, but you alone found 8 items. That's exactly double the number of second place. Dean smiled. I'm flattered. I didn't expect you to join our consortium. The elegant man smiled. Here, you are the seed cultivation object. I believe other consortiums are the same. This is the contract for you. He took out another contract from his bag. Mason, Zach, and Sham were full of curiosity as they stretched their necks to look at it. Dean looked at the contract. The general content was the same as above. There were several benefits that were much higher than above. First of all, he would get a blessing from God once a month. Secondly, he would be able to pick up materials. In addition to the monthly task limit, the extra materials would be appraised according to the value. 30% of the gold coins would be given as a reward. In addition, he would get a temporary residence permit in the commercial district. Chapter 32. Did I see it wrong? The cost of the extra materials is 30%. Isn't that 3 times more than us? Look, the duration of the temporary residence permit is actually 10 years. Wow, if I knew this, I wouldn't have eaten or slept for the past 3 years to study and exercise. Mason, Zach, and Sham cried out in envy. Their cries immediately attracted the attention of other children. They gathered around them. When they saw the welfare terms of the contract, they were envious and jealous. They secretly regretted that they didn't work hard enough in the past 3 years of special training. Nori frowned as she saw Dudian. He actually chose the Melon Consortium. Does this little guy know something? Lorian, who was standing behind her, heard the words of Mason and others. His heart had a bad taste. He said to Nori, Why is his contract welfare so high? My endurance score is 2nd, and my comprehensive knowledge score is 3rd. It's not much different from him. Nori looked back at him and smiled sweetly. It has always been like this. The first will always get preferential treatment. Lorian's face was ugly. In the past 3 years of special training, The top 5 had competed with each other and regarded each other as opponents. So when he saw Dudian getting such preferential treatment, it was inevitable that he was not convinced and jealous. The withdrawal fee was 10% higher than his, but the main reason was the 10-year temporary residence permit in the commercial district. It was too much to make him jealous. Boy, don't be unconvinced. Although your results are excellent, but this little guy named Dudian's performance in every exam is extremely outstanding. What we really care about is the results in the practical exam. It's useless to rely on rote memorization and endurance. If you can't use it in practice, then it will be in vain. At this time, the previous man said with a smile. Lorian's face became more and more ugly as he heard his words. Nori coldly snorted. You should worry about yourself. If you can't even recruit a top 5 student, then how will you go back and explain to your boss? The man frowned and turned away. He didn't want to argue with the woman. Are you satisfied with this contract? The elegant man from the Melon Consortium looked at the gathered people. There was a hint of joy in his eyes as he gently asked Dudian. Dudian quickly glanced at the terms of the contract. He pondered for a moment. It says that every 3 months I have to obey the consortium's arrangement and go out to scavenge. In addition, the rest of the time, I have to stay in the consortium and receive special training. Can this be changed? The elegant man was surprised. He didn't expect Dudian to face such generous benefits. He didn't think that Dudian wouldn't immediately be tempted. Instead, he started to negotiate. He felt strange in his heart, but maintained a smile on his face. If you think 3 months is too tight, then once every 4 months is the limit. Dudian shook his head. 3 months is no problem. Once every 3 months is no problem. Can I allocate the rest of the time? The elegant man was taken aback. He hesitated for a moment and said, I'll have to ask the higher-ups about this. Generally speaking, special training is compulsory, especially for someone like you who is the target of seed cultivation. Hey, little guy, even if the Melon Consortium doesn't give it to us, we can. At this time, another burly middle-aged man laughed. The elegant man's face slightly changed as he angrily said, Bolton, you are violating the rules. How come I don't think so? Another mature woman smiled and said, Our Green Consortium can also accept this young Mr. Dew's conditions. The elegant man's face changed. He clenched his teeth and said to Dudian, Well, I promise you. Dudian was relieved. He secretly thanked the two in his heart. The contract will be revised and given to you when we return to the consortium. The elegant man said to Dudian, I don't have God's blessing with me. I will give it to you when we return to the consortium. You stand behind me, and then we will go back together. Dudian nodded slightly. The other consortiums could only regretfully give up. But the previous burly middle-aged man didn't give up. Little guy, if they go back and breach the contract, you can come to our Huashan consortium. My words are always valid. The elegant man angrily looked at him. Bolton, you are slandering us. The burly middle-aged man shrugged his shoulders and turned around to continue to win over other students. The elegant man coldly snorted. His eyes fell on Mason and the others. His expression softened as he said, Are you together? Mason nodded again and again. Yes. Can you give us more benefits? The elegant man was speechless. I really can't change it. These are the rules. Mason looked up and saw that no other consortiums were coming to compete with him. He couldn't help but be disappointed. Well, the elegant man couldn't help but be angry as he saw his actions. Soon, all the students were divided by the 7 consortiums and the military. Each consortium led their recruited students to ride the carriages of their respective consortiums to the headquarters of the consortium. Dean and others opened the curtains and looked at the distant field behind the carriage. There was some sadness and reluctance in their hearts. For the past 3 years, the sweat and the experience of falling and climbing up again and again were like a microcosm, forever imprinted in their memory. Goodbye. The carriages came to a bustling area. The pedestrians on the road saw the flags on the carriages. They hurriedly avoided the carriages for fear of blocking them. After a moment, several carriages of the Melon Consortium stopped in front of a bustling street. The elegant man took the lead to jump off the carriage and entered a huge building on the side of the road. After a moment, 7 or 8 young girls came out of the building and came to the front of the carriage. They opened the door and said to the people inside the carriage, "Elders, please." The children in the carriage looked at the white and tender girls. They were at a loss for a while. Duddian got off the carriage. The elegant man went straight to him. His face was full of smiles as he said, "Come with me. I'll take you to handle the identity procedures." He turned and led the way. Duddian immediately followed. Mason and others also followed behind Duddian. The people in the other carriages were led by the girls and followed behind. After you have your identity, you will be part of the Melon Consortium. From now on, you will enjoy the benefits of the Melon Consortium. You will also have to abide by the rules of the Melon Consortium. The elegant man said as he led the way, "Dean, you are the seed of this session. There will be a noble gathering tonight. You can come and see the upper-class celebrities of the commercial district. These people are from the families of the Melon Consortium. They are our superiors." Duddian asked, "Can I not go?" The elegant man was stunned. "Why? I want to go back and see my parents first." Duddian said. The elegant man suddenly came to a realization. There was some admiration in his eyes as he said, "I can understand, but seeing that your parents are not in a hurry, this is a rare opportunity. Others can't participate even if they want to. Besides meeting the nobles, Lord Hunter will also be present. If you can gain the favor of Lord Hunter, I believe your future will be limitless." Hunter? Duddian was startled. He immediately thought of Fino and Zack 3 years ago. The matter of him being taken to the Hunter's castle should be confidential and not spread out. However, it seemed that although the identity of the Hunter was a secret, but it was only for ordinary people and guards. It was not a secret for the scavengers. "Okay," Duddian agreed. Mason, Sham, and Zack were envious. "You kid, how come all the good things fall on your head? I'm so jealous." "No, we must go back and let Dean treat us," Zack suggested. "Agreed." Sham immediately seconded. Duddian rolled his eyes and ignored them. "So what is the Hunter?" Mason asked curiously. Chapter 33. Dean was taken to a luxurious office. There was an old man sitting inside. When the elegant man pushed the door open, a pretty young girl was sitting on the old man's lap. She was holding a burgundy glass filled with crimson wine. She was enjoying life. "Peter, can't you learn how to knock?" The old man patted the girl's buttocks, signaling her to leave. He then turned around and said with a straight face. The elegant man laughed. "It's you who doesn't know how to lock the door every time." The old man glanced at him and noticed Dean following behind him. He raised his eyebrows. "Is this the group of scavengers you selected? Why did you bring them here?" Peter smiled. "This is the seed talent of this group of students. His contract needs to be modified. Rest assured, everything is within the scope of permission." "Oh." The old man looked at Dean with interest. "Boy, you did a good job this time. You were able to win over the top scavengers. If you train well, our consortium may have one more hunter in the future." Peter smiled and said to Dean, "You sit down first. The new contract will be sent soon." He said to the old man, "Take out the identity medal and uniform." The old man smiled and opened a drawer. He pulled out a stack of black standard soft armor. Dean sat on the sofa and saw the uniform. He couldn't help but think of the people who took him to the special training 3 years ago. They were wearing uniforms exactly the same as this. "This is your scavenger medal and uniform." Peter handed the clothes and medal to Dean. There were 2 different medals. This is the guard medal. When you meet a civilian, you only need to show this medal. This will be your disguise in the future. If you meet a noble or a knight, you can show the scavenger medal. Dean looked at the 2 medals. The guard medal was silver and engraved with cross swords. The scavenger medal was black and engraved with the outline of the giant wall of Sylvia. It was similar to the pattern on the banknotes. "You are the seed of our Melon Consortium." Peter sat down next to Duddian and said, "After each scavenger hunt, the consortium will give you the Fountain of Light. This is an extremely expensive potion purchased from the Holy Church. It can purify the radiation in your body, so you don't have to worry about radiation problems. Once you accumulate enough points, The consortium will give you the opportunity to enter the hunter school. As long as you can persist, you can become a hunter. Dean's eyes flashed. He didn't expect that in addition to the innate light physique mentioned by the hunter named Pheno, there was such a way to become a hunter. Sure enough, the opportunity is given to the prepared people. If he didn't know that he was going to carry out scavenger training, he wouldn't have trained himself so hard. Naturally, he wouldn't have such excellent results. I'll try my best. Dean took the medal and uniform. I believe you can do it. Peter encouraged. Dean asked, compare the status of a hunter and the aristocracy. Who is higher and who is lower? Peter laughed. It depends on the level of the hunter and the level of the aristocracy. Some of the aristocracy will politely flatter you when they see an excellent scavenger like you. After all, scavengers can bring wealth to the aristocracy. It can be said that scavengers are the favorite workers of the aristocracy. However, in the eyes of the ancient aristocracy, scavengers are nothing. Only hunters can satisfy their appetite. Dean's eyes moved. Are there levels of hunters? Of course, but you will know later. So you must work hard and don't let down the consortium's training. Peter encouraged. The benefits of being a hunter are far more than you think. Not only will you get permanent residence in the commercial district, but you will also be equivalent to an aristocrat. If the accumulated merits are high enough, you will get a title. Dean nodded slightly, although he knew that Peter was throwing bait for him, but he was still a little excited. However, he didn't care about the permanent residence in the commercial district or the title of nobility. In his view, these were just the appearance of vanity created by the rulers of the world. What he was really excited about was the privileges and power of the hunters. Since 3 years ago, when he almost died in the hunter castle, he clearly realized that only by gaining power could he control his own destiny. He would no longer be dominated and trampled. Living as humble as an ant would eventually be trampled to death by the footsteps of the big shots. At that time, self-pity would only appear more pathetic. By the way, your group of scavengers will carry out the first scavenging task in 7 days. Peter laughed. You have to perform well. This time, the higher-ups will pay attention to your results. The specific content and location of the operation will be informed to you. Before that, my suggestion is that you should immediately wash yourself and change into clean clothes. I'll pick you up in the evening. Nobles hate dirty and messy things. Remember to comb your hair neatly. Dean nodded slightly. I'll pay attention. At this time, the door opened and the pretty girl came in. She handed a contract to Peter. Peter looked at it and handed it to Dean. Look at it. If there is no problem, then sign it. Once again, Dean looked at it from the beginning to the end. The previous changes he proposed had been corrected. He immediately took the quill pen from Peter and quickly signed his name. Done. Peter put away the consortium's contract and said to Dean, keep the contract well. Oh yes, remember to wear your medal at night. It is a symbol of your identity. If it is not necessary, it is best not to leave your body. I will. Now, you can join the others outside. Someone will take you to a temporary residence. Dean nodded and turned to leave. He went out of the room and closed the door. By the time he returned to the hall, Mason, Zach, and the others had received their respective uniforms and medals. There was no difference between them and Dean. The beautiful woman saw Dean come over and said, Everyone, come with me. I'll take you to a place to stay. Dean and others were arranged to stay in a castle under the name of the Melon Consortium. The environment was comfortable and clean. There were servants and gardeners to serve them. However, they were only allowed to stay for 3 days. After 3 days, except for Dean, everyone else had to return to their residential area. When it was time to perform the task, consortium carriages would bring them to the assembly point. Dean, you really can't take us there? Dean, you can't be the same as Macon. Mason and Zach looked at the neatly dressed Dean. They knew that he was going to attend the aristocratic party. They wailed. Dean tidied up his cuffs and looked at himself in the mirror. He felt satisfied and said to Mason, Help me get my boots. Mason howled. You are too much. Finished, he turned around and handed Dujian's black boots to him. Dean was neatly dressed. He saw the carriage outside the castle from the window. He immediately waved to Mason and the others. I'm going." He went downstairs and left the castle. He put the medal on his shoulder. "Not bad. You look quite handsome after dressing up." Peter opened the curtain and said with a smile. Dean smiled and stepped into the carriage. It didn't take long for the carriage to reach a secluded place in the commercial district. It was a very huge castle. There were high walls outside the manor. There were a row of lanterns hanging on the walls. More than a dozen exquisite carriages were parked outside the manor. There were servants guarding the carriages. The banquet had begun when Dean and Peter arrived. Melodious music floated out of the manor. Peter smiled. "It seems that we are a bit late. Go in and remember to be careful." Duddian nodded. Peter took Dean into the manor after showing his identity and invitation card. They went along the path to the banquet hall. There was a special servant who helped them open the door. Brilliant light came out of the hall, and faint music floated out. It was quiet and melodious. It's Master Haydn's Moonlight Beauty. Peter's eyes lit up as he rushed in. Dean was about to keep up when he saw a tall figure in front of him. He looked up and saw a middle-aged aristocrat wearing exquisite silk clothes and a jade ring on his finger. Chapter 34. Dean was angry in his heart. "You're the one who blocked my way. How dare you say that I don't have eyes?" However, thinking of Peter's words, he resisted the urge to refute and said, "It was Mr. Peter who brought me here." "Who is Peter?" The middle-aged aristocrat frowned. "You brought a scavenger here? Are there any rules?" "Mr. Matt?" At this time, a voice came from behind. Dean and the middle-aged aristocrat looked at the same time. It was the old man that Dean had seen in the office today. He had changed into a black gentleman's suit. A middle-aged lady was holding his arm. Both of them seemed to be husband and wife. At this time, the old man saw Dean and was surprised. "Little guy, what are you doing at the door? Didn't Peter come with you?" Dean honestly said, "Mr. Peter just went in." At this time, the middle-aged aristocrat named Matt frowned. "Old Luo, do you know him?" The old man laughed. "I just met him. This little guy is the seed of the scavengers. I will have to rely on Mr. Matt to take care of him in the future." "So that's how it is." Matt seemed to understand. He glanced at Dean. "Little guy, you chose our melon consortium. You have a good vision. Don't be in a hurry. There are no rules at all." Dean's face was ugly. His fists were tightly clenched in his sleeves. The old man quickly said, "Little guy, apologize to Mr. Mason, go in. Pay attention to the banquet is about to start. Don't delay the banquet." He winked at Duddian, indicating that he would apologize to Duddian. Dean saw a trace of anxiety on his face and knew that he was helping him out. He also knew that as long as he apologized, this little episode could be over. But he didn't feel happy at all. Instead, he felt that his whole body and limbs were gradually getting cold. At this moment, he suddenly realized that the right and wrong of the matter had nothing to do with the matter itself. It depended on each other's identity and status. And these two things were the difference in strength between the two sides. He suddenly understood that the truth was only in the hands of the powerful people. "I'm sorry." He lowered his head and apologized. Behind him were the dazzling lights of the hall and the melodious music. His face was hidden in the shadows, and he could see the exquisite boots of the other party. Then he saw the pair of boots move and turn around to enter the hall. The old man seemed to glance at him, but did not say anything and followed him in. These civilians, no matter how well they are taught, they will never learn the rules. Matt's voice came from behind, followed by the old man's laughter. Dean still bowed his head and clenched his fists. After a long time, he slightly raised his head and looked at the wide manor in front of him and the lanterns in front of him. He suddenly felt that staying in the darkness where the lanterns couldn't illuminate seemed to be much more free. At this time, another noble carriage came galloping over. Dean silently retracted his eyes and didn't continue to stay at the door. He turned and entered the hall. The large and spacious hall was illuminated by the oil lamps as if it were daytime. A large number of servants could be seen walking back and forth in the hall, carrying fine wine and sliced fruits. Melodious piano music could be heard coming from the front of the hall. The hall was filled with exquisitely dressed nobles. chatting in groups of 3 to 5. After the previous incident, Dean was no longer in a mood to enjoy this rare luxury party. He came to the least crowded windowsill and leaned against the window. Looking at the appearance of the people in the hall, he only felt that there was a flowing picture in front of him. His heart didn't have any waves, and even a touch of boredom, until suddenly 2 black uniformed figures appeared in his line of sight, interrupting his trance. Hunters! Dean immediately recognized the medals on the shoulders of the man and the woman. It was not the outline of a scavenger's giant wall, but a black falcon. He saw that the 2 hunters were very young, 17 or 18 years old. After entering the banquet, they passed by many nobles along the way. These nobles took the initiative to say hello to them. Apparently, they already knew each other. Soon, the 2 hunters came to the center of the banquet. There were several middle-aged nobles standing there. Matt, the one who had apologized to Dadian before, was also standing there. Next to him was a fat lady and a thin middle-aged man with a mustache. After the 2 hunters passed by, several middle-aged nobles laughed and chatted with them. Dean couldn't hear what they were talking about, but he could see that the 2 hunters had a high status in front of the nobles. Hunters! Dean's eyes flashed slightly. He suddenly thought of Roseyard's alchemy notes. One of them recorded something that left a deep impression on him. It was the vivisection of a hunter. What had happened was that a young hunter had received a mission to kill him. The result was that he had used the potion pharmacist's poison to control him. He had used him as a test subject. He didn't use any anesthetic and directly dissected him into countless pieces of meat. Roseyard found the flesh and blood of a different species from the body of the hunter. It gave him a lot of inspiration. It was one of the factors that led to his certification as a 3-star alchemist. Hey, scavenger! Just as Dean was thinking, a figure suddenly sounded. Dean looked at the speaker. It was a white-haired old man with a kind face. He was holding a crutch with a thumb-sized emerald on top. His clothes were relatively simple. To be able to attend this gathering, are you a seed of the consortium? Asked the white-haired old man with a smile. Dean nodded slightly. You are? The white-haired old man smiled. I'm Feline Ryan. It's nice to meet you. Ryan? Dean's eyes moved. 3 years ago, the desert exam had taken place in the territory of a noble called Ryan. The white-haired old man noticed the slight changes in Dean's face. He smiled. Presumably you have heard some things about our Ryan family, but it's all in the past. Don't mention it. Are you interested in becoming a knight of our Ryan family? Knight? Dean was surprised. He wasn't like 3 years ago when he didn't know anything. He had been studying in the library for the past 3 years. His understanding of the world had become clear. The so-called knight wasn't just a simple title. He had to go through professional training and strict assessment of the Knight's Hall in order to obtain a knight certificate. I didn't make it clear. The white-haired old man replied. It's just a nominal title. Our family will give you the salary of an official knight, and you only need to help us explore the wasteland once a year. Dean suddenly understood the purpose of the old man. This should be against the treaty. Can I go out alone for your family to scavenge? Chapter 35. Dadian was excited. The monthly salary of a knight wasn't low. It was estimated that it was more than the monthly salary of Jura couple. The most important thing was that he could join the Ryan family as a knight. Most of the civilians would look up to him because of this identity. However, he didn't immediately agree. He knew that the higher the reward was, the more dangerous it would be for him to scavenge outside the giant wall. Although he had heard from Fino that they would only scavenge in the safe areas, but was difficult to guarantee that there wouldn't be other dangers. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such a high reward. I'll think about it. Dadian pondered. Old Feline smiled. You are welcome to join us at any time. In addition, you haven't found a place to live yet. If you don't mind, there are several vacant houses in Ryan's house. Dadian declined. Thank you for your kindness. I'll go back to my home to visit my parents. I won't live in the commercial district for the time being. Well, if you need anything in the future, don't hesitate to come to me. I will. After the conversation, old Feline left and went to the center of the banquet to talk with other aristocrats. Shortly after old Feline left, several aristocrats came to Dadian to discuss with him. However, The conditions they proposed were not much different from old Feline's. Duddian declined them one by one. At this time, the melodious music suddenly stopped. A loud clap was heard. All the aristocrats who were chatting or eating in the hall looked towards the source of the clap. The person who clapped was a middle-aged aristocrat who was about 40 years old. He was tall and had a full belly. He saw that everyone's eyes were focused on him. His face showed a gentleman's modest smile. "Welcome to the 8th party of the Melon Consortium. I hope you will have a good time. In addition, today is the birthday of my daughter Caramel. I hope that everyone can give her a blessing. Thank you." As he spoke, a girl in a dark red dress slowly walked out from behind a high platform in the middle of the hall that led to the second floor. She was about 12 or 13 years old, with delicate cheeks and simple yet elegant clothing. She stood there gracefully, bowed slightly, and said, "Greetings, uncles and aunties." The nobles present immediately burst into applause. Dean's heart was moved. He had inquired about the Melon Consortium after returning to the accommodation. The Melon Consortium was composed of more than a dozen aristocratic families of different sizes. Only 2 of them had the right to speak. They were the Mel family and the Bourron family. This girl was obviously a member of the Mel family. He had heard of this family's name when he was in the Mysian orphanage. Moreover, the Knight of Light who had judged the alchemists in the desert 3 years ago was called Melk. Obviously, he was also a member of Mel family. It could be seen that the influence of Mel family was extensive. "This is a small gift that our Prin family prepared for Miss Saya." At this moment, a young man among the nobles spoke, holding an exquisite red gift box in his hand. He gently opened it, revealing a pair of snow-white silk gloves with extremely exquisite workmanship. Caramel's eyes lit up. "This is Master Sidney's craftsmanship. Thank you, I like it very much." The young man smiled and handed the gift box to the servant who came to receive the gift. At this time, the other nobles presented their gifts one after another, along with congratulatory words. "Miss Saya," a young man in a brown gentleman's suit laughed. "I have heard that you like poetry. I specially asked Master Tiza to write a poem for you. I hope you will like it." "Poem?" Caramel's eyes lit up. She was somewhat happy. The young man smiled faintly and took up a stance. He sang softly, "Your tears are on the stone. Your hesitant eyes are filled with that dusk. Who is it that revealed the sorrow in your heart?" After a moment, he finished reciting the poem. "This poem is called Maiden's Sorrow. I will give it to Miss Saya." The audience suddenly applauded. Some nobles loudly cheered on the spot. There was a happy smile on Caramel's face. "It is indeed a poem by Master Tiza. I like it very much. I am very touched. Thank you." Dean was listening to the cheers from the window. He felt helpless in his heart. He didn't bring anything with him. He hoped that those people wouldn't notice him so as to avoid unnecessary trouble. "If it doesn't work, then I will take out the poem that Sister used to read." Dean secretly thought. Suddenly, he caught a glimpse of the manor outside the window sill. There was a figure running past. His heart moved, and he scolded himself for being stupid. If there was nothing to give, wouldn't he sneak away first? He looked at the nobles. At the moment, their attention was focused on Caramel. This was a rare opportunity. He immediately opened the window and looked outside. It was about 2 meters high. He didn't hesitate to jump out like a flexible cat. He lightly landed on the ground and pulled down the window. He quickly left along the path outside. In order to avoid meeting the servants, Dean went to a more remote place. There were no lights here. At the moment, there was only the moonlight shining on the stone path. There were neatly trimmed ornamental trees around. It didn't take long for him to see a small pavilion. He wanted to sit there and wait for the banquet to end. It wouldn't be too late to go back. Anyway, he was just a small character, so he wouldn't attract too much attention. Rustle. Suddenly, there was the sound of leaves being shaken. Dean's face slightly changed as he shouted, "Who is it?" The surroundings were quiet, but Dean knew that it was not the sound of the wind blowing. After all, after 3 years of scavenger training, if he couldn't distinguish between objects and the sound of the wind touching the leaves, then he would have been eliminated in the practical exam. "Come out. I know you are here," Dean said in a cold voice. It didn't take long for a slender figure to come out from behind a tree that was pruned like a ball. Dean looked at it with the moonlight and was stunned. It turned out to be a girl about the same age as him. Looking at the clothes, it seemed that it was the same figure he had seen before. Dean was relieved. Come out. I don't mean any harm. Everyone is hiding from the limelight. I won't tell anyone. You better not tell anyone either. Otherwise, it won't be good for everyone. The girl was wearing a white floral dress. She was a little nervous, but when she heard Dean's words, she was surprised. Hiding from the limelight? Are you not sent by my father to call me back? Dean knew that she had misunderstood. He shrugged. Of course not. I don't know you. The girl looked at him and seemed to understand that she was thinking too much. She was relieved and patted her chest. You scared me. You said you were hiding from the limelight. What limelight are you hiding from? Do you have enemies? Dean snapped. What enemies can I have? We didn't bring any gifts, so we came out to hide from the limelight. The girl seemed to suspect that she had heard wrong. She suddenly thought of something and laughed. Yes, which family are you from? Don't you know that today is Miss Mel's birthday? You don't know either? Dean shrugged. As for identity, it's better to keep it a secret. The girl walked along the stone to the pavilion and immediately saw Dean's clothes. She was surprised. Your uniform? Are you a scavenger? Dean's face suddenly turned black. Yes, but you'd better not go out and talk about it. I won't say anything. It's fair. I won't say anything. The girl giggled. My name is Jenny. What's your name? Chapter 36. What kind of world is outside the giant wall? The girl curiously looked at Dean. Is there the boundless sea and the endless forest that the bards talked about? Dean turned back to the pavilion and found a chair to sit down. He shrugged his shoulders. I have just been appointed as a scavenger. I haven't been outside the giant wall, but there is definitely the sea and the forest. How do you know? Jenny followed him to the pavilion and sat on the chair opposite the white lacquer round table. She wondered, didn't you say that you haven't been outside the giant wall? Hearing her words, Dean's heart suddenly thought of the earth, the blue sea and the forest that he had seen. There were many beautiful scenery. All of this was gone after the global nuclear explosion. He felt sad and murmured, I have seen it. Of course I know. You have seen it? Jenny was surprised. Where did you see it? Dean came back to his senses. He knew that he had spilled the beans. I saw it in the bard's poems, but I believe that they certainly exist. Otherwise, how could the bards know about it? It can't be fantasy, right? Do you think so too? Jenny was surprised. I think so. But my father always said that those are fabricated by the bards. It doesn't exist in reality. Even if it exists, it will never be outside the giant wall. He also said that it is very dangerous outside the giant wall. Is that so? Dean thought that her father was afraid that she would be too curious and would secretly run to the giant wall to peep at the scene outside. He said, danger does exist. Is it really dangerous? Jenny's eyes showed a bit of disappointment. Dean saw her sad eyes. He suddenly felt that he had personally extinguished a good hope. He couldn't bear to say, however, although there is danger, it doesn't mean that there is no sea and forest. I believe that one day the danger outside the giant wall will disappear. We'll be able to go out and see the mountains and the sea. We can go wherever we want. Jenny's face suddenly glowed. Really? Really? Dean said in a serious tone. Jenny's face showed a happy smile. I think so too. I have told my father before, but he always dispelled such ideas. He said that the outside of a giant wall is an ominous place. Except for special personnel like you, other people are forbidden to enter. Dean smiled and didn't say anything. I really want to go outside the giant wall. Jenny's face was full of longing. Suddenly, she thought of something. She looked at Dean and said, since it is so dangerous outside the giant wall, why do you want to be a scavenger and go outside the giant wall? Dean thought that he would have to ask the nobles about this. However, seeing that she was still young and obviously not involved in these aristocratic politics, he said, there is no why, perhaps like you. I want to go outside the giant wall. Jenny looked at him with a hint of admiration on her face. You're really amazing. We're obviously the same age, but you're much braver than me." Dean smiled. "Because I am a boy." Hearing this, Jenny couldn't help but blush. She secretly looked at Dean and saw that he didn't notice her shy appearance. Her heart was slightly relieved, but her heartbeat was slightly faster. She thought, "How can I be alone with a boy in the garden? If my father knew about it, he would teach me a lesson." Thinking of this, she was ready to get up and say goodbye to Dean. Dean saw that she didn't speak for a long time. He thought he said something wrong. "Don't get me wrong. I don't mean to discriminate against women. There are many girls among us scavengers. However, I think you should listen to your father. It is really dangerous outside the giant wall. Sooner or later, you will be able to see the outside world. I believe that day won't be too late." With the faint moonlight, Jenny looked at the boy's serious and confident face. She couldn't help but be startled. She subconsciously said, "Really? Yes." Dean nodded affirmatively. Jenny heard his determined words and seemed to be infected. She said, "I believe in you." Dean smiled and said, "I also believe in myself." Jenny laughed. She was ready to get up and leave. After laughing, she said, "You know, my dream is to become a magistrate. Although the magistrate can't go outside the giant wall, but at least I can judge all the bad people inside the giant wall. I believe that when there are no bad people in the world, we can work together and soon we can sweep away the dangers outside the giant wall." Dean smiled and said, "Did you study the law?" "Of course." Jenny grinned, revealing a proud expression. Duddian laughed. "I have also studied the law." Jenny was surprised. "You also studied the law?" "Self-taught," Duddian added. "Do you want to be a magistrate?" "Well, the goal is as great as you." "Great?" "Ha ha. Yes, our goals are great." "How old are you this year?" "Just reached 11. I'm almost 12. As the night deepened, in the garden, in the pavilion, the two became more and more engrossed in their conversation. They didn't even realize that time was flying. It was as if they had endless things to talk about, from their hobbies to their age, to their views on things. They had something in common, as if they had found a confidant. One has no ears, the other has no tail. Jenny covered her stomach and laughed. She completely forgot to pay attention to her aristocratic image. What kind of strange song is this? Such a strange tune. It's so interesting, huh? Dean spread out his hands. It's a children's song. Jenny burst into laughter again. How could there be such a weird children's song? It would scare the children. However, there seemed to be no other explanation for the strange lyrics and simple tone other than a children's song. Dean was about to say a few more children's songs when he felt a mosquito bite on his wrist. He killed it with his backhand. He could not help but look back at the direction of the banquet hall. Jenny saw his action and reacted. She quickly got up and said to Dean, "I have to go back. Father will be very angry if he can't find me." Dean was also ready to go back. "You go first. I'll go back later so that we won't be seen." Hearing this, Jenny couldn't help blushing. She turned around and ran out of the pavilion. Suddenly, she thought of something and turned back. "You just said that you've heard a lot of good poems. I also like poems. Can you give me one?" Duddian was surprised. There was no shelter from the pavilion. The moonlight fell on the girl's cheeks. She was as beautiful as a fairy. His heart jumped and subconsciously said, "No problem." He immediately regretted it. He had heard Tang poetry. It was the classical poetry of the East. It was completely different from the poetry of this world. Suddenly, he thought of the modern poem that his sister often read. He could only bite the bullet and softly read. "How to let you meet, may my most beautiful moment. For this I have been in front of God for 500 years, beg him to let us have an earthly relationship. Then God turned me into a tree growing on the side of the road that you must pass." Dean remembered that the poem was called a flowering tree. The word Buddha was changed to God. After all, the belief of the world was the Holy Church and the Father. There was no Buddhism. Chapter 37. Duddian waited for Jenny to leave for about 10 minutes before walking along the garden path. It didn't take long for him to arrive in front of the banquet hall. He heard a burst of hearty laughter from afar. He saw that the banquet hall's door was completely open. It seemed that the banquet had ended. Duddian didn't expect to come out at the same time as the banquet ended. He secretly thanked the mosquito that had bitten him in time. He didn't enter the banquet hall, but walked along the main road to the outside of the manor. He came to the middle part of the main road and saw that there were no nobles. He immediately trotted over and pretended to come out of the banquet hall and was ready to return. After a moment, he came to the outside of the manor. There were a large number of carriages that were previously parked here. There were only 7 or 8 carriages left. Duddian saw that Peter's carriage was still there. He was relieved and walked over. There was no one in the carriage. Apparently, Peter hadn't come out yet. Duddian sat in the carriage and waited inside. It didn't take long for Peter to come back drunk. He saw Duddian sitting inside the carriage. His tongue was numbed by alcohol. Why are you here? Come, drink another cup. I have long admired your name." Then he bent down and kneeled down in front of Duddian. Duddian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He quickly helped him up and said, "You drank too much. Come and sit down." "Elder, I will do as you say." Peter spoke vaguely, but obediently sat down in the carriage. Dean looked at his drunk face and sighed. He lifted the curtain and said to the coachman, "Let's go back." "Yes, Elder," the coachman respectfully said. He shook the rope and the carriage started to move. Duddian got off the carriage and asked the coachman to send Peter back to the scavenger headquarters of the Melon Consortium. At the moment, it was late at night. Mason and others had already gone to sleep. In addition to the attendants who were guarding the door, the maids and servants in the castle had already rested. Dean went back to his room and lay on the bed. Many things that happened today emerged in his mind. There was anger and humiliation, but also the joy and beauty brought by the beautiful girl. He thought about it and gradually fell asleep. The next day, Dean woke up early in the morning. He saw Peter quickly coming to the castle with a wooden box in his hand. "Good morning, Mr. Peter." Dean greeted him. He was a little surprised. He didn't expect to be so drunk last night. But after one night, he recovered and was full of spirit. Peter smiled and said, "I drank too much last night. I heard from the coachman that you sent me back." "Of course." Dean looked at the small box in his hand. "What is this?" Peter put the box on the table in the living room and opened it. There were syringes inside. Dean immediately knew that Peter had come to give them the God's blessing. "I just got it yesterday. I didn't have time to give it to you. I don't need to introduce these things again." "Dean, you have 2 copies. One is the basic distribution, and the other is the one you received in the first month. The second one will be given to you next month." Peter smiled. Dean asked, "Can I take it back and use it myself?" "Of course not." Peter shook his head. "This is the power given by the Holy Church on behalf of God. It must be used in the presence of a witness. This is the rule. I have sent these to you, so I am your witness." Dean was a bit regretful. He wanted to take one back to study. However, he didn't have any instruments in his hand, so he couldn't study anything. "Come on, I will get it to you first," Peter said as he picked up the syringes from the box. Dean was a bit worried. Are there any sequelae?" Peter's face stiffened. "I will listen to these words. In the future, don't talk nonsense outside. You are questioning the God of light." Dean naturally understood this point, so the wording was tactful enough. He didn't directly ask if there would be any side effects. "You can rest assured that this is a gift from the God of light. Not only is it permanent, but scavengers who use it have never had any adverse reactions." Peter answered Dean's words. Dean was a bit surprised, but didn't say anything. His heart was secretly awestruck. Could the Holy Church produce a perfect genetic potion? In this way, wouldn't they be able to mass-produce scavengers? At this time, Peter inserted the syringe into his arm. Dean didn't feel any pain, but his arm was a bit numb. Soon, the red liquid in the syringe was pushed into his body. Dean only felt a heat suddenly spread from his whole body. When spread to his limbs, a violent heat rushed to his brain, as if all the blood in his body was gushing into his brain. He couldn't help but roar. The heat immediately receded and flowed into his limbs. His limbs were in extreme pain, as if they were about to be torn apart. He clenched his teeth and endured the pain. Soon, the heat faded like a tide. Dean looked up and immediately felt the difference. His vision was very sensitive. He could see the pores on Peter's face at a glance. Dean thought of Lorian's power, so he immediately jumped in place. Dean felt as if he was flying. He jumped over Peter's head. His feet were at least 2 meters above the ground. He fell back to the ground and raised his hand to grab the chair next to him. Suddenly, he felt as light as a catkin and could wave it at will. Well, wait for a while. There's still one more. Peter laughed. Dean looked at the second syringe he picked up and couldn't help but ask, "What will happen if I inject all of these? Will I become infinitely powerful?" Peter smiled and said, "Of course not. The effect will be very significant for the first injection. But the more the injection, the weaker the effect." Although Dean expected this, he couldn't help but feel some regret. If it could be multiplied, then the Holy Church who mastered these gene potions would simply be a monster-like existence. However, thinking of this, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart. They were just scavengers, but they had such terrible power. If they were hunters, how terrible would it be? Soon, Peter injected the second syringe into Dean's arm. The heat once again surged from his body, but this time it was not as strong as the previous one. Dean only felt a slight tearing pain, and the heat sank. Dean looked again and immediately felt that his vision was a lot clearer. He estimated that his strength had improved a lot. He thought that even if a tiger was in front of him, he could probably kill it. "Go and teach the others to come over." Peter laughed. Dean nodded and called Macon and others to wake up. It didn't take long for everyone to finish the injection. For a time, the whole castle was particularly noisy in the morning. Everyone was lively and experienced the incredible power in their body. After Peter left, Dean returned to his room, packed up, and prepared to return to the residential area. "We can stay for 3 days for free. Are you going to leave today? We are going to the nearby, lively market to play today. Why are you in such a hurry to go back? It's rare to have such an opportunity." Mason and others were surprised and tried to persuade him. Dean made up his mind. After saying goodbye to them, he called a carriage and went to the civilian area. The carriage sent him directly to Lin Kong Street, 108 in the civilian area. Dean jumped out of the carriage and paid 60 copper coins. He couldn't help but feel pain in his heart. The rental price of a carriage in the commercial district was twice as high as in the civilian area. Fortunately, Jura couple gave him 100 copper coins, so he still had 90 left. At this time, Dean suddenly saw another carriage parked in front of the door. He couldn't help but be surprised. Is it a guest? He bypassed the carriage and pushed open the white guardrail outside the door. As he came to the door, he heard quarreling sounds coming from inside. He was surprised and immediately raised his hand to knock on the door. Soon, the door was opened. Jura opened the door. She strangely looked at Dean and said, "You are?" After 3 years of scavenger training, Dean's appearance had changed dramatically. His body was much stronger than before. His skin was not so pale, but tanned to a wheat color. Jura didn't recognize him for a while. "Andy, it's me," Dean said. Jura couldn't help but widen her eyes when she heard his voice. She couldn't believe it. "Are you Dean?" Dean chuckled. "The training is over. I'm back." Jura's eyes suddenly turned red. She held Dean in her arms and said, "You're back. You're finally back. Your uncle and I were worried every day. We were afraid that you would have an accident there." Fortunately, she immediately pushed Dean away. She looked up and down at him. She was relieved to see that his hands and feet were intact. Dean saw her exaggeration. He smiled and said, "I wanted to bring you some specialties from the commercial district, but I didn't have any money, so I didn't buy it." "Silly boy, you're back. Why did you bring specialties?" Jura smiled and stroked Dean's hair. "I haven't seen you for 3 years. You've grown so tall. Where did you— Johnny, don't go too far." At this time, an angry voice came from the living room. Dean immediately recognized that it was Gray's voice. Chapter 38. Duddian felt strange, but followed into the living room. In addition to Gray, there were 2 figures in the living room. One was a fat middle-aged man with a full belly. There were 3 or 4 gold rings on his fingers. The other was a thin man wearing a black gentleman's suit. His hair was neatly combed. He looked like an aristocrat. "Gray, pay attention to your attitude." Duddian heard the thin man's voice as he came in. Gray clenched his fists and looked at him angrily. We bought this house, and the tax has been written clearly in the contract. You want to raise the property tax? That's not legal at all. The fat middle-aged man chuckled and said, Illegal? You're just a small tailor. What do you know about the law? The entire Lin Kong Street is my territory. In my territory, my words are the law. Even if you go to the magistrate, you are welcome to go there at any time. Gray gritted his teeth. You are robbing. Well, you are slandering, and attacking me. I can sue you, the thin man said in a cold voice. At this time, Jura looked at Gray's red face. She quickly held his hand and said to obese middle-aged man, Give us some time to discuss this matter. We really can't afford such a high tax. Fat middle-aged man indifferently said, You are very sensible, but I have already given you a few days. Today is the last day. I will come again in the evening. I hope you can give me a satisfactory answer. With that said, he stood up, adjusted his collar, slightly raised his head, and walked in front of Gray. Wait a minute. At this time, a figure blocked in front of him. It was Dudian. Huh? Fatty bowed his head and looked at Dudian, whose head only reached his chin. He frowned. Little guy, who are you? At this time, Gray also noticed Dudian. He was stunned as he saw Dudian's complete change in appearance. Dean? You're back? Dean nodded slightly, then looked up at the obese middle-aged man. I think it's very hard for you to go back and forth with your figure. It's better to talk about it. Moreover, we don't like to be disturbed by others. The obese middle-aged man was stunned for a moment before he smiled and said, Little guy, you are quite sensible. I heard that Gray has an adopted child. Is it you? Dudian didn't answer him, but continued. First of all, according to the land law, Chapter 3, Article 6, anyone who buys land and real estate must pay the property tax and rent. It can be seen that aunt and uncle have paid the fees when they bought the house. Otherwise, they wouldn't get the property certificate. So the problem comes. In Chapter 4, Section 7 of the law, all the ownership rights and taxes of a house belong to the owner of the house. Only the lord of the house has the right to reclaim it. Dean looked at him. Did you say that the entire Lin Kong Street is your territory? Can I see the proof of your territory? Even if you want to collect taxes, you'll need to go to the magistrate's court and show your lord's certificate under the witness of the magistrate. Only then will you be able to obtain the tax contract, right? The obese middle-aged man could not help but be stunned. The thin man who followed him was startled for a moment. His face turned gloomy. Little guy, what nonsense are you talking about? Do you think you can see the proof of the Lord? Dean looked up at him and calmly said, If you can't come up with the proof of the Lord, then please leave and don't disturb me again. Otherwise, I will arrest you as a sinner who has disturbed the residents. Hearing this, the people present were surprised. The thin man responded and laughed. Arrest me? Little guy, I think you are too young to understand. If you continue to talk nonsense, I will directly send you to the guards. I don't need you to send me. Dean took out the medal of the guards and indifferently said, Based on what you just said, I can sue you for slandering the guards and arrest you. As for the crime, according to the 7th article of the law, maliciously slandering the nobles will be sentenced to 3 years in prison. Slandering the guard will be sentenced to 2 years in prison. If you attack the guards, you will be sentenced to death. Which one do you want? Dean looked up at the two of them. The obese middle-aged man and the thin man looked at the medal of the guards. Their eyes widened, and their faces were full of disbelief. They were speechless. Jura and her husband were stunned to see the familiar medal. Soon, they remembered the purpose of Dean's 3 years of training. They looked at each other and saw the excitement and surprise in each other's eyes. They did not expect that Dean would succeed. Are you a guard? The obese middle-aged man still couldn't believe it. It was the first time he had seen such a small guard. Dean indifferently said, Are you questioning me? The obese middle-aged man quickly shook his head. Although it was inconceivable, but he still recognized the medal. Moreover, pretending to be a guard was a big crime. It was not as simple as being beheaded. It is the first time I have seen such a young and promising guard. The obese middle-aged man dryly laughed. Dean indifferently said, This only shows that you are not a real lord. There are many guards like me. Before reaching the age of 16, We will join the aristocratic guard establishment to gain experience. After reaching the age of 16, we will be transferred to guard the boundary wall and the giant wall. The boundary wall referred to the high wall in the middle of each area. In the aristocracy, it was called the Wall of the Rich and the Poor. The fat middle-aged man looked a bit embarrassed as he said, I really am the lord of this place. My grandfather was once a great knight and was given this territory, but, speaking up to here, he felt a bit resentful and didn't continue. It's just that this territory was given to your grandpa Knight by a noble, and he's no longer around, so the territory lost its legitimacy and was taken back. Of course, maybe that noble forgot to take it back, so you guys continue to call yourselves lords. Dean indifferently said, but it is illegal. I think if you disappear immediately, I can consider not to pursue it. The obese middle-aged man and the thin man looked at each other. They immediately bent down and said, then we will leave first. Then they moved away from Dean's side. Not long after, the carriage outside the door roared and left under the pain of the whip. Dean looked up at Jura and her husband. He hadn't seen them for 3 years. There were a few wrinkles on the corners of their eyes. They should be in their 30s. In this world, the concept of 30 years old was similar to the concept of 50 years old in the old era. Jura and her husband recovered and looked at Dean in amazement. They didn't expect that the trouble that had previously troubled them would be solved in just a few words from Dean. Gray was overjoyed. You graduated smoothly? You're indeed my son. Ha ha. I didn't expect that my son would become a guard. Tomorrow, I'll go to the factory and tell my fellow workers about it. I'll make them jealous. Jura glanced at him and smiled as she stroked Dean's hair. You have been tanned so much. You must have suffered a lot in the past 3 years. Dean smiled. It's nothing, but I can't stay for long. I have to perform a task in a few days. I can't accompany you. Jura was stunned. Perform a task? What task? Is it dangerous? It's not dangerous. Don't worry. That's good. Gray laughed. What danger can there be as a guard? It's nothing more than accompanying the aristocracy to stroll around. Now that we have the protection of the Holy Church, those evil devils won't dare to show up. Jura snapped. Just in case. Gray smiled and shook his head. He didn't say anything. That night, Jura prepared a very sumptuous dinner for Dean to celebrate his return and becoming a guard. After dinner, Dean said to both of them, Auntie, I want to borrow some money. It's a bit much this time. Jura laughed. Why do you want to borrow money? How much do you want? Chapter 39. So much. Jura couple was stunned. 1 silver coin was equal to 100 copper coins, and Gray's monthly salary was about 2 silver coins. As for Jura, her salary was slightly higher, but it was only about 3 silver coins. She would only get some extra commission if she occasionally visited a rich family or a lord. 10 silver coins was basically equivalent to 2 months of salary for them. What do you want so much money for? Gray frowned. The task needs it. After the task is over, I will return it to you. Dean said seriously. Jura and Gray looked at each other and said helplessly, Well, it is your celebration fee, but you have to promise me that you will not use it to do bad things. Dean breathed a sigh of relief. He knew that the money was indeed a lot. Jura and Jura were willing to give it to him because of his identity as a guard. Otherwise, how could an ordinary child get 2 months' salary from their parents without telling them the reason? The next day, Dean went out early in the morning and went to the Adventurers Bazaar in the southern residential district with 10 silver coins in his pocket. Whether it was the slums, the residential district, or the commercial district, they were divided into 4 regions: east, west, south, and north. Each region was extremely vast. Dean lived in Lin Kong Street, which was located in the southeast of the residential district. The so-called Adventurers Bazaar was a free trade market for civilians outside of the Chamber of Commerce. The goods here were found by civilians in the outer edge of the residential district near the giant wall. In the outer edge, the nuclear radiation was dense in the air. Only some adventurers were willing to go there. But adventurers often didn't last long. Generally, They retired after a few times and used the money they earned to support their body. However, Dean didn't have to worry about the nuclear radiation there. He had checked the information. He had received a set of black standard soft armor made of lead. Lead was a very dense metal that could effectively resist radiation, so he could freely enter and exit the outer edge of the giant wall. After all, compared with the outside of the giant wall, the radiation in the outer edge was not worth mentioning. However, although he had the protection of the uniform, he would breathe in the polluted air. Moreover, the outer edge was too far away from the residential district. It was not a small price to hire a carriage. In addition, there were animals eroded by radiation. It was very dangerous. Dean was too lazy to waste time going there. After spending 5 copper coins, Dean came to the Adventurer's Bazaar. There were a lot of carriages coming and going. It was very lively. He could hear the noise of hawking from far away. The ground was covered with a variety of things. Some were homemade clothes and dolls, some were strange colored stones, and some were dried rare animal meat. Dean strolled along the aisle. Half an hour later, he finally found a few pieces of crude sulfur ore and white ice like saltpeter in front of a stall. As for charcoal powder, he could make it himself and didn't need to waste money to buy it. The owner was a middle-aged man with dark skin and a withered body. His hair was messy and his eyes were sunken. There were some red spots on his hands, as if he was infected with some kind of disease. Even though they were covered by his long sleeves, they were still revealed when he raised his hands. Dean knew that the person's body had a very high radiation value. Most likely, he would not live for more than a few years unless he got treatment from the Holy Church. After some bargaining, Dean finally bought all the saltpeter and sulfur ore at the stall for 1 silver coin and 20 copper coins. The saltpeter was more valuable, so he spent 1 silver coin. This sulfur ore has to be refined by myself. After the refined sulfur is ground into powder, it should only be enough to make a bag of explosives. In addition, when I go out to scavenge, I'm not allowed to bring anything other than food and basic weapons. I can't bring much black gunpowder, so I'll buy this for the time being. Dean calculated in his heart. Little guy, these things are very heavy. Do you want to call a carriage or your family's adults to help you? Do you want me to help you carry it? The middle-aged man said with a smile after receiving the money. No need. Dean picked up the linen bag. The bag weighed about 20 pounds, but it was as light as nothing in his hands. He turned around and continued to look for grinding tools. The middle-aged man slightly opened his mouth and blinked his eyes. It didn't take long for Dean to buy some basic alchemy tools from other stalls. In the eyes of ordinary people, these tools naturally had nothing to do with alchemy. For example, the stone wheel that Dean used to grind sulfur was generally used by doctors to grind hard drugs. After buying almost everything, Dean strolled around the market. By the way, he knew what materials were available here. If there was a need in the future, he could directly come here to buy. At noon, Dean turned around and was ready to go back to eat. Boss, this broken stone, sell it to me for 1 copper coin, please. Suddenly, a tender boy's voice sounded. Dudian looked to the side and saw a stout boy who was half a head shorter than him, standing in front of a stall. The boy was carrying a small linen bag in his hand and was holding a rough black stone the size of a fist. No. The stall owner was a short and thin young man. He repeatedly shook his head and said, "This is iron ore. Although the weight is very small, but at least I can sell it for 2 copper coins." Boss, even if it is iron or it is just an ore, it is not iron. Such a small piece can't be refined much. You can make a profit by selling it for 1 copper coin. The sturdy boy changed his strategy. Moreover, such a small piece is not needed in the smelting factory. No one will buy it. If you sell it to me, you can make money. If no one wants to buy it, you can only throw it away. The short and skinny young man was moved by his words. He hesitated a little, but finally said, "All right." The sturdy boy grinned and happily paid the money. He put the black stone into the linen bag and turned away. Dean retracted his eyes and was about to turn away. Suddenly, he turned around and looked at the wrist of the sturdy boy who was carrying the linen bag. There was a very small black hook pattern on it. Alchemist apprentice? Dean was startled. He didn't expect to meet an alchemist apprentice here. In Roseyard's notes, he had learned about the lifestyle and some habits of alchemists. The most impressive point was that every alchemist would have an exclusive tattoo pattern. It was the symbol of alchemists, and also one of the basic ways to enter the path of alchemist. The method of tattooing here was very old. Plants or powders were mixed with black water and injected into the skin through a needle. The outline of the pattern was arbitrary. Even if it was a small dot or a shapeless crooked line, it could be regarded as a symbol. Although in addition to alchemists, there were nobles and holy church who had mastered the method of tattooing. But their tattoos were different from alchemists. They would never use black as a pigment. Once a black tattoo was tattooed, whether it was nobles or holy church personnel, they would be treated as alchemists. It could be said that this was an absolute proof. Similarly, if you didn't have a black tattoo on your body, then even if you were a real alchemist, you wouldn't be recognized by others. Chapter 40. The linen bag that the sturdy boy carried was very small and bulging. He obviously did not have a strengthened body like Dean. It was very strenuous for him to carry it on his shoulder. After walking for a while, he was tired and gasping for breath. Dean's vision was more than 3 times that of ordinary people. He didn't have to worry about being detected as he followed far behind. He should be an alchemist apprentice at this age. I don't know if he's using it himself or helping his teacher to buy raw materials. Dean's eyes showed a bit of thinking. At this time, the strong boy stopped the carriage at the intersection and left. Dean's face slightly changed and quickly followed. In this bustling area, the speed of the carriage was not fast. Dean trotted far behind the carriage with yam meat on his back. After 3 years of daily training, his endurance was far beyond ordinary people. After 7 or 8 streets, Dean fell out of breath. When he was ready to hire a carriage to track them, he suddenly saw the carriage in front of him stop. Dean quickly stopped. He saw the strong boy jump out of the carriage. After paying the copper coins, he entered the roadside alley. Dean immediately walked over and pretended to pass by. He turned his head and looked into the alley. He was stunned to see that the alley was a dead end. It was blocked by a wall, and the sturdy boy had disappeared into the alley. What the hell? Dean slightly raised his eyebrows. After all, he was a person who was influenced by science. Naturally, he wouldn't believe that there would be magic in the fairy tales in reality. He entered the alley and carefully looked on the ground. This blocked alley was obviously rarely entered. There was dust everywhere. There were several buckets of garbage piled up at the entrance of the alley. Because of this, Dean's strengthened keen vision immediately saw footprints on the ground. The footprints spread forward and stopped at a wall in the middle of the alley. Dean's eyes flashed. He came in front of the wall and looked closer. He couldn't help but be startled. It was clearly a piece of cloth painted the same color as the wall. If he didn't look carefully, he wouldn't be able to distinguish it. This little trick of concealment. Sure enough, he is an alchemist apprentice. Dean reached out and touched the cloth. He saw that the back of the cloth was hard. Most likely, it was supported by a stone, so it wouldn't be exposed by rats or wind. Dean secretly remembered this place and turned out of the alley. Obviously, this was an alchemist's stronghold. If he reported this to the Holy Church, with his status as a scavenger, he would immediately receive a lot of merit points. However, he was not interested in doing such a thing. On the contrary, he planned to blend into the small circle of this stronghold and learn about the alchemy warlocks of this world. After all, what he knew about alchemy warlocks came from Roseyard's notes. Although there were a lot of things recorded, most of them were information that only senior alchemists could master. There were very few records of basic properties. However, if you want to join the circle of alchemists, you must become an alchemist. And the first step of an alchemist proof was a black tattoo. Dean didn't want to tattoo himself for the time being. He wasn't ready to join the alchemist circle so soon. After all, according to Roseyard's records, the alchemist circle used another identity to communicate with each other. The purpose of this was to avoid being exposed and arrested by the Knights of Light. Then they would be tortured to confess to the others. After I come back from outside the giant wall, I will formally consider this point. Dean looked at the alley and turned to the intersection. He stopped the carriage and went to the slums. He He learned from childhood that doing many things at the same time would affect efficiency. Soon, the carriage came to the boundary of the slums. Dean jumped out of the carriage and returned to the slums. As he approached the slums, the strong smell in the air made him frown slightly. There was a trace of helplessness in his heart. He could only endure the strange smell. He went along the path to a more remote place and found a shabby, small hotel to rent. In the hotel room, Dean took out several raw materials from the linen bag. The first step was to extract the sulfur from a sulfur. He was going to use the most primitive refining method. He would use high temperature to heat the sulfur and dissolve it. He would take the upper layer of the sulfur solution and cool it down. Then he would grind it into sulfur powder using a stone wheel. Dean asked the hotel owner for a brazier. Although it was the rainy season and it was a bit strange to ask for a brazier to keep warm, but Dean gave him copper coins. The hotel owner was very happy and took out the dusty brazier from the warehouse. He also gave him a few pieces of coal. Dean went back to his room and locked the door. He used the fireside that the hotel owner gave him to ignite the coal. After burning it for a while, the fire was too weak. Dean simply bought a big bag of coal from the hotel owner. The melting point of the sulfur was not high, so it melted quickly. Dean took out the equipment that he bought in advance and began to fill the sulfur solution. The room was filled with the strange smell of sulfur. Dean was secretly glad that he was prepared. He put on a mask. Because of the nuclear radiation, the mask did not seem to disappear along with the technological fault. It has always appeared in people's lives. It has to be said that different environments promote different development. Dean thought that in the future, he would get a gas mask like Roseyard's. For alchemists, they often deal with a variety of substances. It was inevitable that some toxic substances would be ingested. The effect of the mask was negligible. It was only used by alchemy apprentices. In the evening, Dean finally finished grinding the sulfur powder and fire saltpeter. As for the charcoal, he was going to go back and make it himself. This thing was simple. I didn't expect that making the oldest black powder would be so tiring. Dean looked at his clothes that were stained with coal. He smiled bitterly. He suddenly yearned for the day when he would have his own alchemy room. I hope I can make a lot of money outside the giant wall. Dadian wiped the dust on his face, but his fighting spirit was high. In the blink of an eye, 7 days passed. The night before the mission, Dean said goodbye to Jura and Jura. Under their watchful eyes, he sat in the black carriage sent by the Melon Consortium's scavenger headquarters. He returned to the commercial district and lived in the previous castle. Mason and the others were also brought along with him, as well as other scavengers who had graduated together with him. I heard that we will leave early in the morning. Mason excitedly said, "Tomorrow we can go outside the giant wall. When I was a child, I wanted to see it, but I was scared by the terrible stories that they told me. Save it. Although the outside of the giant wall is not as terrible as they said, but it is absolutely dangerous." Zack said. Sham smiled as he looked at the things that Dadian had placed on the bedside. "Dean, what did you bring?" "Toy," Dean casually said. He glanced at the black powder tube that he had made in the past 7 days. He thought that since it was packaged like this, it was impossible not to carry it. Chapter 41. The next morning, at dawn, Dean and others were woken up and gathered outside the castle. There were more than a dozen black horses parked here. Dean already knew that these black horses were called black-toothed horses. They had strong disease resistance and could move outside the giant wall for a short time. Get on the horses and get ready to set off. Peter, who was riding on a tall horse, looked like an elegant knight as he commanded. Dean and others each picked a black-toothed horse and jumped on it. If their bodies were not strengthened, then they would have to borrow a ladder to ride such a big horse. But now they only needed to borrow a slight force to get on the horse. "Go!" Peter shouted. His legs clamped the horse's abdomen and took the lead. Dean and the others pulled the reins and followed closely behind. These black-toothed horses were professionally trained, so they were not as terrible as their appearance. They were obedient and very easy to control. There was still some wet fog in the early morning streets. The sound of horse hooves was very clear. Under the leadership of Peter, Dean and others galloped along the street and gradually went to the outer edge of the commercial district. The vague outline of the giant wall in the distant horizon gradually became clear. The black shadow in the morning fog was like a giant beast crawling, giving people an indescribable sense of awe and oppression. In the outer edge of the commercial district, like the residential district, there were large areas of uncultivated wasteland. The land was desolate, mainly sandy and wasteland. It was not suitable for cultivation and naturally not suitable for people to live in. As they stepped into the desolate radiation zone of the outer edge, the black-toothed horses became restless. It was both excited and manic. Their speed suddenly accelerated. After walking straight for more than 10 minutes, the Sylvia giant wall behind the hazy morning mist gradually became clear in everyone's field of vision. As it became clearer and clearer, the huge black pressure was also deeply imprinted in everyone's heart. This was a giant wall so tall that the top could not be seen. The closer they got, the more they couldn't see the height of the giant wall. It was as if it led to the depths of the clouds. The thick wall was natural, as if it was built by a god. There was no trace of construction at all. It was like a complete natural boulder. This was the giant wall. Including Dean, everyone was shocked. When they came to the front of the giant wall, they only felt that they had become as small as ants. Compared to the giant wall, they were like grains of sand, so high. Mason looked up. His neck was almost 90 degrees, but he still couldn't see the top of the giant wall. Zach asked, This is the giant wall built by our ancestors? Everyone was shocked by this great and magnificent project. Dean had the deepest feeling. He was very clear that it was a great thing to build such a giant wall in front of him. Even in the old era, it was an extremely difficult thing to do. It required countless manpower and time. The outbreak of the disaster was extremely sudden. There was no time for people to build such a super shelter. He couldn't imagine that those who survived the nuclear explosion could build such an incredible architectural miracle. This is the Sylvia giant wall that protects us. It was built by our ancestors and the gods. There was a trace of pride in Peter's eyes. He turned to look at the crowd and smiled. Come with me, little guys. He gently pulled the rope and approached the giant wall. He stopped when he was about 100 meters away from the giant wall. He turned over and dismounted. He looked around on the ground and soon saw the target. He bent down and lifted it. Squeak! The heavy iron door was pulled open. They saw that there was a huge iron door under the sand. Peter's amazing arm strength lifted it. Below the iron door was a staircase leading to the underground. Go in, Peter said. Everyone was surprised, but quickly dismounted and entered the tunnel under the iron door. Peter was the last one to come in. He closed the iron door. Everyone suddenly felt isolated from the world. They couldn't help but panic. They saw that the tunnel in front of them extended into the darkness. It seemed to lead to hell. There was a faint oil lamp on the wall. A trace of cold air gushed out from the tunnel. It was accompanied by a whistling sound, as if the ghosts were crying. Aren't we going outside the giant wall? A girl looked back and timidly said. Peter smiled and said, What's wrong? Are you afraid now? It seems that Tobu didn't train your courage in the last 3 years. Dudian asked, Are we going outside the giant wall from here? Isn't it from above? Is there a door? Of course not. Peter urged. Hurry up. Everyone is waiting for you. Dudian was surprised. Is there someone else? Of course, although you are formal scavengers, but after all, it is the first time for you to go outside the giant wall. The headquarters has arranged 2 seniors to guide you. In addition, according to the usual practice, there are 20 consortium training scavengers in your team. Although some of their professional knowledge is slightly lacking compared to you, but they have been outside the giant wall many times. Their experience is richer than yours. At the critical time, you have to learn modestly. Peter laughed. Dudian froze for a moment, but didn't say anything. At this time, everyone went down the stairs. The stairs were deep beyond imagination. It was at least hundreds of meters deep. When they finally reached the bottom, there was a spacious underground passage in front of them. The passage was quiet. The oil lamps on both sides were shining, reflecting some stone patterns on the wall. This is the goddess of harvest Tyche. Peter pointed to an elegant and graceful woman on the wall. "You have to pray well. I wish you a fruitful trip." Dean and others were familiar with the statues of the goddess of harvest in the square of the Holy Church and some intersections of the residential areas. They stopped in front of the goddess of harvest, clasped their hands together, and bowed their heads to pray. "This is the goddess of the hunt." Peter pointed to another valiant and stunning woman next to him. "Every time hunters go out, they will worship the goddess of the hunt to bless them with a smooth hunt." He took the lead and walked forward. Dudian and others finished praying and followed behind him. The spacious underground passage was extremely long, about 200 or 300 meters in length. At the end of the passage was the same stairs. Everyone went up the stairs. It didn't take long for them to reach the top of the stairs. There was also a huge iron door. At the moment, it was opened like a skylight. Dudian followed Peter out and saw a desolate, withered grass. More than 20 figures were sitting or standing more than 10 meters away. "You're finally here. Peter, you're really slow." At this time, a chuckle came from a youth wearing black soft armor. He was tall and straight. There was a 2-foot sword on his waist. He was wearing a black mask. Peter laughed. "What's the hurry? It's still early." The youth smiled and glanced at Dudian and others. "I heard that there's a good seed among the newcomers. Is it possible that he will become a hunter?" Peter raised his hand and patted Dudian's shoulder. "That's him. I will trouble you to take care of him." The youth looked at Dudian and laughed. "No problem. It's getting late. We have to go. When we come back, we will find you for a drink. Remember to treat us." "Every time I have to treat you, you miser." Peter laughed and said to Dudian and others, "I wish you all the best. Remember not to act without authorization. Don't leave the team. I hope to see everyone come back safely after 10 days. Then he turned into the underground passage and left. Chapter 42. My name is Scott. This is my partner, Mia. After Peter left, the youth pointed to a tall and slender woman next to him. He said to Dean and others, "We will be the captains of this operation for the next 10 days. It's best for everyone to listen to my commands. If there's a mess, then it's not good for everyone. Moreover, there will be no small punishment when we return to the consortium." Hearing the punishment, Macon, Zach, and several other surly children immediately became obedient and obediently promised. Scott looked at Dudian. "Little guy, what's your name?" "Dudian. Good potential." Scott nodded slightly, "But don't be arrogant. In front of death, potential is meaningless. You will follow behind me. I will tell you some things that you need to pay attention to." "Is he going to teach me step by step?" Dudian could not help but have a good impression of this person. He nodded slightly to show that he understood. The people behind them heard this. They knew that Scott was going to focus on training Dudian. For a time, many of them were secretly jealous, but they didn't say anything. After all, Dudian's identity as a seed was there. Moreover, he had obtained 2 blessings. Whether it was force or identity, they couldn't shake him. Moreover, there were 3 dormitory brothers behind Dudian. They were the strongest and most united group in their group. Even the grumpy children who didn't care about the consequences didn't dare to provoke Dudian, Mason, Zach, and Shay. "Well, this is your food and water for the next 10 days. This time I have brought it for you. Next time you go to the headquarters, to get it." Scott pointed to more than a dozen black backpacks on the ground. Dudian looked at the black traveler's backpack. He picked one up and untied the rope. He saw that the backpack was filled with mud balls. He had seen them in Jura's house. They were mashed potato balls. The taste was very bad, but it was easy to fill. In other words, after eating one, he wouldn't have the appetite to eat the second one. Mason, Zach, and Shay followed behind Dudian. They quickly picked up 3 backpacks that looked a little bigger. Scott laughed as he saw that the people behind him also wanted to learn from the 3 of them. "Don't choose. It's the same weight. It's given by the headquarters. There's never a mistake. Use your little cleverness later." Mason, Zach, and Sham smiled in embarrassment. "What is this?" At this time, Scott noticed the black powder tube on Dudian's waist. "It's not worth mentioning." Dean said, "It won't hinder me." Scott nodded and didn't say anything else. He turned to the 20 consortium scavengers in the distance and said, "Gather here and prepare to depart. The 20 consortium scavengers were adults with dark skin. Some of them were older than Scott. Scott had summoned all of them. Their standard soft armor was the same as Dudian's. Obviously, the consortium's powerful financial resources were able to guarantee the supply of these hardware equipment. Boss Ku, which district are we going to today? A skinny youth asked. Zone 8. Scott turned to the silent, black-armored woman, Mia, and said, It's getting late. Shall we go? Mia nodded slightly. Scott waved his hand and took the lead in the front. He said to Dudian and other newcomers, The outer edge has been completely cleared. You don't have to worry about anything. Save your strength. Dudian and others thought that Scott was right. Their tight muscles gradually relaxed as they looked around the surrounding environment. There was a wasteland nearby. The ground was quite humid. Dudian had previously noticed that there were a lot of moss on the giant wall. It was completely different from the sandy terrain behind the giant wall. Is this the outside of the giant wall? It's completely different from what I imagined. I thought that everywhere was a desert. Mason, who was behind Dudian, looked around in surprise. Zach laughed. We don't have to worry about the water problem. We can find a place to dig a hole and squeeze out water. Scott heard his words and glanced back at him. There are puddles everywhere on the ground. You don't need to dig a hole to find water. I'm afraid you won't dare to drink. Huh? Zach was stunned. Dudian saw that Scott didn't explain, so he said to him, The radiation outside the giant wall is too high. Even if the water is filtered by the soil, it is not drinkable. If you want to drink water, you have to dig at least tens of meters deep. The difficulty of digging a few meters in the desert is the same as digging a few meters in the desert. It is a waste of physical strength, so we have to save a lot of water. Hearing Dudian's words, Zach and several other children had a puzzled expression on their faces. Scott looked back at Dudian, but didn't say anything. He continued to lead the way in front. After walking for more than 10 miles, they suddenly came to a place with less vegetation on the ground. To be precise, they came to a ruin. Dudian was stunned as he saw the ruins. This was a broken city? In front of him was an asphalt street, but the street was covered with moss and lush vegetation. There were concrete high-rise buildings on both sides of the street. There were 2 or 3-story shops, but at the moment, all of them had collapsed and broken. There was only a crumbling wall that was isolated. It was covered with vines and moss. It seemed that after a few years, it would be completely buried by these dense growth of plants. There were some broken clothes scattered on the desolate street. These messy clothes were obviously very old. They were soaked by the rain and covered with dust. They had long turned into hard and black stone-like objects. Only a rough shape and outline could be seen. Dudian was completely stunned. This was the appearance of a ruined city. Could it be that this was what Earth would look like 300 years after the catastrophe? Once the prosperity, the lights of civilization, the footprints of human beings all over the Earth. Was it like the ruins in front of him, leaving only empty shells after the disaster? He suddenly felt that his chest was blocked by something. He couldn't breathe. His eyes were moist. Dean. Mason saw Dudian suddenly stop and could not help but pat his shoulder. Dudian recovered and saw that Scott and Mia had walked into the street in front of him. He quickly followed them. However, when his feet stepped onto the asphalt street that was covered by vegetation, his heart was filled with all sorts of feelings. The longing for his parents and sister was like a flame that crawled into his mind. However, he was very sorrowfully aware that those who had passed could never come back. This was the reality, just like the reality of the ruins in front of him. This is area number 9. It has been scavenged. Scott saw that the people behind didn't keep up in time. He turned back and waved. Hurry up, don't waste your life. Dudian slightly pursed his lips and bowed his head to keep up with him. Along the way, Dudian saw that the street had been scavenged very clean. Basically, in addition to the collapsed houses, there was nothing left. In such a spacious street, there should be many scrap cars, but he didn't see a single one. Obviously, as Scott said, they had been scavenged. But why the technology inside the giant wall was so backward even after the old era's technology had been picked up? Was it because of the serious nuclear radiation corrosion for 300 years that there was no research value? Chapter 43. Were there people living here before? Mason, Zach, Sand, and others looked at the ruined walls on both sides of the street covered with vegetation. They were surprised. From the traces of the broken walls, they could see that there were residential buildings, but the architectural style was very different. Of course, Scott looked up at the surrounding ruins. This is the place where our ancestors used to live. But the disaster has invaded, and now it is desolate. However, there are still things left behind by our ancestors here. Our role is to bring these things back and hand them over to the consortium, the place where our ancestors lived. Mason and others were excited as they heard Scott's words. They curiously looked at everything around them. Dean saw a sheepskin map in Scott's hand. He looked around the gap between Scott's arms and saw a crooked route on the map. In the center, there was a huge square pattern with the words Sylvia's Giant Wall written on it. Outside the giant wall, there were irregular circles outlined by curved lines. There are numbers marked on the top of the circle. 0, number 1. Dean glanced at the map and found that the numbers were repeated. There were 6 or 7 symbols in the 0 area. However, these symbols and circles were outlined in different colors. It was as gorgeous as a rainbow. Scott saw that Dean was looking at the map, so he smiled. This is the scavenging map outside the giant wall. Each consortium's hunters will mark the area after they have swept it. Our Melon Consortium's area is marked with red lines and handwriting. Other green and yellow areas belong to other consortiums. There are records on the back of the map. Green represents the military and yellow represents the Huashan Consortium. Dean nodded slightly. He had already guessed it when he saw these circles with different colors. He asked, "What is the gray area outside?" "This is the place that the hunters haven't swept yet." Scott smiled and said in a serious tone, "You must not step into these gray areas. It is extremely dangerous. Even the hunters may die." "Dangerous?" Dean was curious. "What kind of danger?" "Monsters," Scott whispered. Dean's heart jumped. "Monsters?" At this time, Scott passed a corner. There was a collapsed traffic light on the street, but it was covered with vegetation and entangled with many vines. So it wasn't collected by the scavengers. Zone 8 is just ahead. Scott looked at the street in front of the corner. It was still in ruins, but because it was close to the center of the city, there was less vegetation. A large number of broken walls and collapsed houses were all exposed. The desolate street was damaged by the aftermath of the earthquake. The street was cracked, and there were many deep craters on the ground that looked like small meteorites. "Everyone, be careful." Scott looked dignified as he pulled out the dagger from his waist and said, "The 8th area is the area that the hunter just cleared. We are the second team to enter this area. Although the harvest will be very rich, but it is very likely that we will encounter some small monsters. Don't let them attack you, or you will be infected." Dean, Macon, and other newcomers couldn't help but feel nervous. They learned from Scott and pulled out their weapons. They vigilantly scanned the surrounding environment and the fluffy vegetation near the street. Dean followed Scott into the middle of the street. He saw a new wooden road sign on the side of the road. There was a blood-red word, number 8, written on it. It meant that the area in front of them was under the control of the Melon Consortium. Dean looked at the street in front of him. It was obvious that the street hadn't been cleaned. He could vaguely see lumps of green vegetation. From the outline, it seemed that there were scrapped cars under the vegetation. His heart jumped. If there were cars, then naturally there would be generators. Although after more than 300 years, these things had long been reduced to scrap iron under the rain and ultraviolet rays. But maybe he could find some well-preserved parts. Scott said in a low voice, "There are some large resources hidden under these green plants. We'll think of a way to bring them back when we return. First, we'll find a place to stay and use it as our base camp for the next 10 days. After that, we'll split up and search for resources." Saying that, he walked past the abandoned cars covered in green plants. Dean and the 20 consortium scavengers followed them. No one noticed that one of the cars was covered with thick plants. A pale and withered hand was struggling to grab the people who had gone far away. At the end of the street, there was a crossroads. There were collapsed street lamps and huge billboards on the ground, but they had long been covered with vegetation. Scott looked up and chose a 3-story building that was relatively intact. He said, "This is it. First, clean up the materials inside and gather them." After saying that, he led the team to the 3-story building. "Ah!" A girl behind Dean's team exclaimed. She pointed to the ground in front of the building and trembled. "Blood, blood!" Everyone looked at the ground. There was a pool of blood, although it had dried up, but from the color it was obvious that it was left recently. After all, the blood on the ground couldn't stay for long under the washing of the rain. Dean's face slightly changed. He thought of the monster that Scott had mentioned. He subconsciously grasped the gunpowder at his waist. The other children were nervous as they saw the blood on the ground. Scott frowned. "What's the fuss about? I told you that there are monsters in these places. This is obviously the blood of the hunter who killed the monster. Don't be surprised again, rookie." His patience towards the other new scavengers was obviously not as high as his patience towards Dean. Mia, who was next to him, came forward and pushed the door of the building. The door was made of glass, but the glass had long been broken. It seemed to be a shop. Although the vegetation had spread all over the walls, there was still a simple layout and a few counters. Dean followed Scott into the shop. He saw that the ground and walls of the broken shop were covered with thick dust. The dust had accumulated over a long period of time. Scott used the hilt of his dagger to push away the vegetation on the counter. He saw some dusty gold jewelry in the glass cabinet. Scott's eyes lit up. He immediately used the hilt of his dagger to break the glass and grab the jewelry inside. He used his clothes to wipe off the dust, revealing the golden luster. He bit his teeth. His face was full of surprise again. Chapter 44. It's gold. Mason, Zach, and others also noticed the jewelry on the counter. Their faces showed a bit of excitement. The smile on Scott's face disappeared when he heard their words. He faintly turned his head and said, "Let me make it clear first. Although we are a team, the materials we pick up are counted separately. This has always been the rule. I'm not deliberately bullying you." He pointed at the 20 consortium scavengers. Mason and others' faces changed as they turned to look at him. They saw the consortium scavengers were led by a skinny youth. He nodded and said, "Yes, the materials we pick up are all based on our ability. So don't think about being lazy. Whoever is lucky enough to pick up the most is the one who has the ability." Mason and others were frustrated. There was no doubt that Scott was the first to find the gold jewelry. Naturally, it was his materials. They couldn't get any commission. Dudian was disappointed as he heard the rules. But he soon cheered up. The rules were actually fair for the newcomers. At least the materials they picked up wouldn't be shared with others. Scott was lucky enough to randomly pick a place to stay. It happened to be a gold shop, so he made a lot of money. At this time, Scott smashed all the glass on the cabinet. He pulled out all the jewelry and piled them up in one of the cabinets. Then he clenched his dagger and said, "Let's go upstairs and clean up." He thought of something and turned to Dudian and others. "Everyone has picked up the materials. It's best not to try to steal or use other dirty methods to seize them. If the owner of the materials dies in the process of scavenging, then the materials he picked up will belong to the consortium and won't be shared." Dudian knew that he was warning the newcomers not to be blinded by greed. At the same time, he secretly appreciated that the consortium had set up such rules to a large extent to prevent the scavengers from killing each other in the wilderness. After hearing Scott's words, the children standing at the end of the line clenched their weapons and followed the team. Scott and Mia took the lead as they walked along the stairs. The corridor was covered with vegetation. There were cracks as thick as a finger. There were some things scattered on the ground. Although covered with thick dust and vegetation, Dudian recognized them at a glance. They were women's shoes and wallets. It seemed that they were silently telling of the riots that had taken place here. Bang! Suddenly, a middle-aged consortium scavenger stepped on the stairs and collapsed. His whole body also fell down and hit the ground. Fortunately, this was only the first floor, and he had a blessed physique, so he did not suffer any injuries. But this sudden movement scared the others. Scott looked back and frowned. "Be careful." He took the lead and went to the second floor. The corridor was dark. The ventilation windows had long been covered with vegetation. The sunlight couldn't penetrate. It was damp and dark inside. Scott took out a fire sickle and lit a torch. The dim yellow light illuminated the surroundings. He held the torch and walked in front. When he reached the first room in the corridor, he saw that the door of the room was half closed. Scott gently pushed the door open. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind blew out of the room, almost extinguishing the torch. Scott slightly lowered the torch. His other hand was holding his sword. He slowly entered the room. He saw that the floor was in a mess. The chairs were overturned, the curtains were torn in half, the windows were broken, and the vegetation was dense outside. "Katja!" Suddenly, a slight sound came from the depths of the room. Scott's face changed. He immediately raised the torch to illuminate the room. He saw that there was a bathroom in the room. The bathroom curtain had collapsed on the ground. Two pale and dry thighs were sticking out of the bathroom. As his torch shone, he immediately saw that the owner of the thighs was a woman whose face was completely rotten. The slight sound came from her chest. There was actually a huge black mouse lying on the ground, constantly gnawing on the woman's chest. Dean's pupils shrank as he saw the scene from the gap between Scott's arms. The size of the mouse was as big as a hound. Its body was covered with thick, dark hair and exuded a strong, rancid smell. Its tail was as thick as an adult's finger. It was gnawing the corpse with relish. "It's a monster!" Scott was the first to react. He roared and slashed with his sword. The huge rat that was eating the woman sensed the fire behind it. It turned its head and looked over. Its eyes were bloodshot and filled with violence. Its sharp mouth was stained with sticky blood, and a few extremely long whiskers were fluttering slightly. It seemed to notice that Scott had more people on his side. It paused for a moment, then suddenly turned around and ran into the bathroom. It stepped on the bathtub and jumped out of the window. At this time, Scott and Mia's attacks all failed. They looked at each other with lingering fear. At this time, Macon and others also noticed the movement. They heard Scott's words and gathered around. Scott whispered, "It escaped." Then he put down the torch and shined it on the dead woman. The woman seemed to have died with her eyes wide open. Her pupils were light green as she stared at him. "It stinks," Macon said while covering his nose. Dean forgot to breathe. His heart was full of shock. Could it be that after 300 years of nuclear radiation, the genes of the mice that lived here had mutated to such a terrible degree? His gaze landed on the woman. She was completely naked, and her body was covered by the bathroom curtain. The stiff flesh around her chest had been gnawed deeply by the rat, and even half of her heart had been bitten off. Her ribs could be seen mixed in with the dry, hard flesh. However, his gaze landed on the woman's glabella, where there was a bloody hole the size of a finger. It was as though she had been shot by a bullet. Dean was startled for a moment. He rejected the possibility of a bullet. Instead, it was more likely that it was caused by a bow and arrow. After all, the power of a bullet could cause obvious tear and damage to the flesh around the bullet hole. However, what made him unable to understand was that if this woman had died from a bow and arrow, then she had died in the hands of a human, who would use a bow and arrow to kill her. Suddenly, he thought of a point that he had overlooked. Suddenly, his whole body's hair stood up. This woman was obviously taking a bath. But the water system in this house should have been broken long ago. Whether the other side was a scavenger or a hunter, they would never be able to endure not taking a bath for 10 days. Most importantly, people in this world would rarely take a bath like this. Is she a human from 300 years ago? Did she die in a bath? But if so, her body should have rotted long ago. Dean was startled. At this time, Mia suddenly squatted down. It seemed that she didn't want the woman to die in the wilderness. She slightly lifted the curtain to cover her body. However, when she lifted the curtain, Dean inadvertently saw that the woman's arm was actually a sharp claw. The nails turned into sharp and long thorns. 5 sharp thorns were slightly curved. It was hard to imagine how much damage would be caused by such a hand. Chapter 45. Undead, Undead. Scott murmured. There was a trace of disappointment on his face as he saw Mia carefully cover her body. He sighed. Clean up the room. This thing must be burned, otherwise it will breed other monsters. Mia's mouth slightly moved. She silently got up and looked at the woman's rotten face. Eventually, she turned her head and started to clean up other usable materials in the room. Dean was shocked as he heard Scott's words. He could not help but ask, "What is an undead undead?" Scott looked back at Mia's back. He saw her silently picking up the materials on the ground and the table. He sighed and said to Dean, "Undead undead is one of the monsters of the undead family. Their power is extremely terrible. They have night vision ability. Even if they don't eat or drink, they won't die. They like the taste of blood. So any creature that gets close to them will be eaten by them. Moreover, they will absorb the life force from the flesh and blood they eat to enhance their strength. In short, the more people or animals they eat, the more terrible they will be." Dean could not help but ask, "How did they come here?" Scott sighed. "They are infected by the devil's power. These undead were human beings before their death, but they couldn't withstand the temptation of the devil's power. Eventually, they abandoned their souls. Although they got eternal life, they lost their personality and all the memories of their life. They became the devil's minions." Infected? Dean naturally did not believe in the devil's words. He asked, "Is it because of the radiation?" Scott did not expect him to get to the bottom of the matter. He looked at him and shook his head. Of course not. Radiation will only damage the body and cause some distorted changes, but it will never turn people into such monsters. They were infected by the devil's power. This power is like a plague and can spread to each other. For example, the bone biter rat that escaped earlier is a low-level monster. Once it bites you, you will also be infected. Dean could not help but be stunned. Infect each other? Isn't this a virus? But where did this virus come from? Could it be that 300 years ago, when he was asleep, other things happened in the world? Scott sighed and said, "These rats like to hide in dark corners and are often ignored by hunters. Although we can kill them with our strength, but if we're not careful and get scratched by them, we will be infected and turn into an undead." Scott sighed and said, "These rats like to hide in dark corners and are often ignored by hunters." At this point, he glanced at Mia, who was picking up the resources, and sighed. Mia's ex-husband had his arm bitten by a steel fur rat. Clang! A metal object in Mia's hand suddenly fell to the ground. Scott sighed but didn't say anything more. He looked at Dean and others. Everyone split up and cleaned the rooms. Remember to be careful, as these monsters can smell the blood in our bodies. Although this one ran away, but it must be lingering nearby. Be careful of them hiding in the dark to attack you. It's best for the rookies to form a team of 4 and look out for each other. If anything happens, just call for help. His instructions were mainly for Dean and the other newcomers. Although the consortium scavengers were not as good as the regular scavengers, but they had come to scavenge more often. They already knew what they needed to know, so there was no need for him to explain more. Hearing Scott's order, the people at the back scattered. However, Mason, Zach, Sham, and several other children were standing in front of them. They saw the terrible appearance of the undead on the ground, as well as the huge size of the rat. Their hearts were filled with anxiety. They had never seen such a bloody scene before. For a time, the knowledge they learned in the usual training suddenly disappeared. At the moment, they just wanted to hug Scott and stick close to him. Scott looked at the pale faces of the children and slightly frowned. Scavenging is not such a simple job. Didn't your instructor tell you? If you continue to follow me, then you won't be able to pick up anything. It's equivalent to a wasted trip. You probably don't know, but if your scavenging results are ranked at the bottom several times, then you will be expelled by the consortium. Expelled? Mason, Zach, Sham, and others turned pale. They clenched their teeth and resisted the fear in their hearts. They clenched their weapons and turned to leave. Dean was about to turn to leave, but Scott shouted, "You don't have to follow them. Just follow behind me. I'll give you a third of the things I've picked up. You just have to learn how to scavenge. Next time, no one will take you." Dean frowned. "I want to see alone. If something happens, I will call for help." Scott was taken aback. He looked at him and said, "All right, be careful." Dean nodded slightly and said to Mason and the other two, "Let's go." Mason secretly gave him a thumbs up. After they left the room, Dean saw that the other rooms on the second floor had been searched. He immediately said, "Let's go to the third floor." Mason, Zach, and Sham didn't have any objection. In the course of 3 years of training, they had almost formed the habit of letting Dean have the final say. The third floor was also the top floor. The vegetation was sparse. Gray and turbid sunlight shone through the gaps of the broken windows and sprinkled on the ground. There was a thick layer of dust on the floor. There were dried bloodstains on the walls. There were messy things scattered in the corridor. There were several corpses lying on the ground. Some bodies were cut at the waist, and some heads were smashed by some heavy objects. There were traces of blades on the walls. Obviously, there had been hunters here, and there had been a battle. Dean noticed that the fingers of these corpses were sharp claws. It seemed that they were infected by the virus. Although he didn't know where the virus came from, but there was no doubt that the virus had such an amazing effect. It was absolutely something that could be produced by the world's top biological research institute. It was even possible that it was created by those guys. Mason, Zach, and Sham saw the corpses on the ground. They swallowed their saliva and trembled. Although they had killed poisonous snakes, lizards, and other animals in the training. They had seen blood, but they were numb to it. But the corpses lying in front of them were human beings. They had the same life as them. This kind of fear made the three of them feel nauseous. They felt their limbs were cold. It seemed that the corpses would suddenly climb up and rush towards them to take their lives. Dean was also afraid, but he tried to keep calm. With the help of the sunlight, he came to the front of the first room. The door of the room was open. The anti-theft chain was broken. It was obvious that it had been broken by violence. There were traces of fighting in the room. There was a pool of blood on the ground. There were 2 corpses. It was a young man and a woman. Their skin was abnormally pale. To be precise, it was gray without blood. Faint blue veins appeared on their bodies. Their fingers were sharp. Their hands and feet were thin. It seemed that all the fat in their body had been sucked out, leaving only muscle tissue. Dean put on a scavenger's mask and immediately felt the stench was a lot lighter. His voice was a bit low through the mask. "Don't touch the body. Look for other things around first." His eyes swept through the room. At a glance, he saw a laptop covered with a thick layer of dust. Chapter 46. At this time, Mason, Zach, and Sham were also searching for materials in their respective rooms. They deliberately avoided the 2 corpses on the ground. Although they knew that the 2 corpses were dead, but because of this they were afraid. After searching around, Mason and the other 2 found some metal objects. Although they did not know the role of these objects, but in their values, as long as it was a metal object, it must be valuable. Dean saw them pick up mobile phones, TV remote controls, electric lights, and so on. His heart could not help but be curious. Scavengers should have found a lot of these things. How come the consortiums didn't study anything from them? However, when he saw the twisted metal behind the mobile phone, he suddenly understood that the 300 years in the radiation zone and the 300 years in a normal ecological environment were very different. Although these items were still there, but they have long been distorted under the accumulation of nuclear radiation. The parts were completely deformed. If one did not know the original use of these distorted parts, it was impossible to speculate useful things. The only thing that could resist the nuclear radiation was lead and gold and other high-density metals. This was why the gold jewelry on the counter had not changed much. "Go to the next room." Dean swept around and did not see anything valuable. He turned and left the room. This was the advantage of going to the newly swept area to scavenge. Not only the value of the things picked up was high, but also there was room to choose. Like the rooms they had seen today, in the future there will be other scavengers who will come sweep, but they can only pick some cloth clothes or remove the metal from the beds, refrigerators, and other large objects. Mason and the other 2 did not want to stay in the room with the corpses, so they immediately retreated. In the corridor, several corpses were lying quietly. It was exceptionally quiet. Dean looked at these corpses. He always felt that they would suddenly wake up. His heart was pounding. He suppressed his thoughts and opened the door of the second room. Not surprisingly, there were several corpses lying in this room. Looking at their short-sleeved clothes, it was obvious that they were people from 300 years ago. Dean had to be sure of one thing. 300 years ago, when the global nuclear bomb broke out, there was also a terrible virus disaster. This unknown virus turned all the infected people into terrible undead. Even if they stayed in the nuclear radiation zone for 300 years, they still didn't die. It could be seen how terrible and tenacious the virus in their bodies was. Dean bypassed the 3 corpses on the ground and searched the room for things. He was mainly looking for computers, mobile phones, and other electrical appliances. After all, in a residential house like this, the only valuable things were these things. There was a desktop computer in the room. Dean naturally would not carry the whole computer back. He disassembled the computer. The electrical box and some wires inside were full of dust. When he saw the electrical box, his heart moved. He was just about to disassemble it. Who would have thought that when his palm touched the electrical box, it was like touching a thin layer of paper, easily poking into the electrical box. The electrical box had completely deteriorated after being exposed to nuclear radiation for so long. Dean sighed and looked at the other wires. The plastic outside these wires was distorted and bloated. Some of the small resistors on the motherboard were shriveled and swollen. Some of them were swollen into a strange shape. They had lost their original appearance under the nuclear radiation. Dean shook his head slightly and gave up the machine. After all, today was only the first day of scavenging. There were still 9 days left. There were many things that could be picked up, but the things he could carry were very limited. If there is a truck, I can carry as much as I want. Such an idea suddenly emerged in Dean's mind. His heart was suddenly smart, but soon he was discouraged. The scrap cars outside were obviously similar to this computer. Many parts had deteriorated or deformed and could not be repaired. If he wanted to make a mechanical transportation tool, he had to rely on the super chip. And the premise of all this was, there must be electricity. Dean turned and continued to search for other things. He only saw one way to make a generator, which was a wind generator. To make a wind generator, first of all, he needed an open field. Even if he went to the slums to buy such a field, it would cost a lot of money, so he still had to have money first. When Dean and others were searching the third room, the others also went up to the third floor and searched around. After half an hour, the building was completely searched. The goods that each person had plundered were piled up in the hall on the first floor. Everyone registered with Scott to prevent confusion and to prevent others from stealing. Obviously, in the long history of scavenging, scavengers have long understood that eliminating civil strife was the best way to get the greatest benefits. Now, everyone, go and search around the area, Scott said to everyone after he finished registering. The 20 consortium scavengers were already impatient. They immediately formed groups of 4 or 5 and left the shop to search for materials in the nearby ruins. Scott looked at Dean and said, "Mia and I are also going to search for materials. Do you want to go with us?" Dean shook his head. "No, I'll go with my friend." "All right, call for help if there is any danger. It is very quiet here, so you can basically hear everything. Just don't go too far." Scott didn't insist. Dean nodded and turned around to call Mason, Zach, and Sham. They went along the street and searched the nearby buildings. Because he knew these shops, Dean basically didn't need to go inside to know what kind of things he could find in the ruins. He didn't search every building one by one like the others, but moved along the street and soon found a small and medium-sized supermarket. The supermarket was covered with vegetation, but it was still recognizable as a supermarket from the style. But he didn't know what kind of disaster it had suffered. The supermarket had collapsed from the middle. There were a few corpses lying on the ground in front of the door. So many undeads. Mason and the other 2 saw the corpses on the ground, and their faces turned ugly. They came to the 8th area, and they could see corpses everywhere. They couldn't imagine what kind of scene the hunters faced when they came here for the first time. Dean was also a little scared, but he still kept his calm. It seemed that the hunters had kicked open the door of the supermarket. Suddenly, he saw the ground was covered with corpses of the undeads. At the same time, there was a low gnawing sound. There seemed to be 7 or 8 red spots in the darkness. Mutant monsters. Dean's pupil shrank as he quickly retreated. Chapter 47. Dean hurriedly rolled sideways to avoid the attack of the gray shadow. At the same time, he looked up. It was a giant rat with pitch-black hair. It looked the same as the bone-biter rat that had escaped before, but its body was a bit thinner. At this moment, it was like a hound, baring its sharp teeth and staring at him with blood-red eyes. Monster! Mason, Zack, and Sand screamed. Their faces were a little pale, and their legs were a little soft. Whoosh! The bone-biter rat missed its attack. After landing, it jumped up again and pounced on Dean, who was the closest to it. Dean's hair stood up. The speed of the bone-biter rat was too fast. He had no time to dodge again. Moreover, it was the first time he faced such a battle. His brain reaction was a little slow, and he instinctively raised his arm to resist. With a bang, he felt that his upper body was hit by a heavy object. He lost his balance and fell backward, sitting on the ground. He was so scared that he instinctively wanted to close his eyes, but the last bit of reason in his heart reminded him that he would only be waiting for death if he did so. He struggled to open his eyes, only to see the bone-biter rat pouncing on him. The rat's sharp mouth was extremely long, and its tiny teeth were tightly biting his arm. Panic, fear, and longing for time to stop. Save me! Save me! A lot of chaotic thoughts suddenly poured into his mind. When life encountered a desperate situation, instinct immediately completely swallowed up reason. However, this was only a momentary thought. Dean had a calm mind for a long time, so he quickly recovered his reason in panic. When he saw the bone-biter rat's upper and lower jaws were constantly wriggling and chewing his arm, a sharp pain came from his arm. His heart was filled with a huge anger. Dean roared and swung his arm, smashing it on the street. At the same time, he turned over and climbed up. His other hand released the dagger and grabbed the hind leg of the bone-biter rat that was biting his right arm. He pulled hard, and at the same time, his right arm kept hitting the ground, making its head violently hit the ground. Bang! 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 After continuous violent smashing and pulling, the bone-biter rat did not persist and quickly loosened its mouth. Dean roared and shook its body, smashing on the ground. Bang! The bone-biter rat hit the hard ground, and its hair and flesh offset a lot of the impact. Die for me! Die! Die! Dean roared and smashed the bone-biter rat on the ground again and again. The bone-biter rat's hard head collided with the ground, and its bones immediately cracked. Soon, blood spilled from the corner of the bone-biter rat's mouth. As Dean swung it high, the blood spilled along the corner of its mouth like a parabola. With a bang, Dean didn't know how many times he had swung the mouse, but the anger in his heart gradually subsided. A sense of exhaustion spread through his arms. He looked at the bone-biter rat that had lost its struggle, gritted his teeth, picked up the dagger on the ground, and fiercely stabbed it in the stomach. The dagger was extremely sharp. After 7 or 8 consecutive stabs, blood stained the dagger. Dean saw that the bone-biter rat had completely lost its movement, so he stopped attacking. He only felt that his heart was still beating wildly. Recalling the previous frightening scene, he still had a lingering fear. This was the first time he faced fear and death. Although he had seen the most terrible doomsday, it was just the tip of the iceberg that he had seen on TV. It was like watching a disaster movie, and it was completely different from his own experience. Without looking in the mirror, Dean could feel that his face was extremely ugly at the moment, and his appearance was also extremely embarrassing. He slightly gasped and looked at his right arm. There were several deep teeth marks on it. Fortunately, the material of the black soft armor was extremely hard, and there was a layer of lead metal inside, so it was not bitten by the bone-biter rat. Otherwise, the speed of infection through saliva would be much faster than other ways. He would probably become an undead like Mia's husband that Scott said. "Dean!" Macon shouted in vain. Dean was startled and looked up at him. but he saw Macon suddenly rushed over, raising his dagger and chopping head-on. Dean suddenly woke up, thinking of the 7 or 8 red spots he had seen in the supermarket, and hurriedly rolled on the ground. Puff! Macon's dagger fiercely stabbed the back of Dean at the moment when he dodged. Blood sputtered out. The dagger stabbed the chest of a bone-biter rat that jumped over. It was the softest part of the bone-biter rat, and the dagger directly stabbed into it. Dean hurriedly looked back, and suddenly saw that in addition to the bone-biter rat that was stabbed to death by Macon, 3 bone-biter rats rushed out from the broken glass door of the supermarket. Their blood-red eyes stared at them. Like agile cheetahs, they quickly jumped from left to right and rushed toward Macon and Dean. Dean's face was ugly. He grabbed the dagger and retreated again and again. The dagger in his hand kept gently waving to intimidate these things. However, the simple intimidation did not scare these bone-biter rats. One of them jumped in front of Dean and jumped over. Dean hurriedly slashed the dagger. The blade cut the bone-biter rat's hair, but it was removed by the greasy and tough hair. The blade slipped and stuck to the bone-biter rat's body. It was like using a sword to slap it, and it did not cause any damage at all. The next moment, the bone-biter rat fell on Dean's chest. The 2 sharp claws in front of it waved and scratched Dean's face. It was like the hunting instinct of a beast, knowing to attack the opponent's vital parts. Dean hurriedly grabbed its hair. Once the skin was scratched by it, the germs accumulated in the claws would immediately infect him. However, the friction of the black soft armor gloves was not big, and the bone-biter rat's hair was extremely slippery. Dean tried his best, but he still felt the hair slipping in his hands. Once again, his life was facing a desperate situation. Dean roared and suddenly turned over with his feet on the ground. His body twisted in a very soft posture, and he stood up without using his hands. At the same time, his arm grabbed the last trace of hair and pushed the bone-biter mouse to the side, sending it flying. The bone-biter rat fell to the ground, rolled around, and climbed up again. It bared its teeth and rushed toward Dean again. Dean's heart tightened, his whole body muscles tightened, and his spirit was highly concentrated at this moment. At the moment when the bone-biter rat rushed over, he kicked out. With a bang, the bone-biter rat jumped up. Just at this moment, Dean's foot seemed to have expected its attack and accurately kicked the position of the bone-biter rat. The kick was extremely heavy. The bone-biter rat let out a sharp scream and flew upside down. Dean did not stop, but took the initiative to rush out. When the bone-biter rat fell, Dean had already caught up. Taking advantage of the fact that it had not climbed up, he clenched the dagger with both hands and stabbed it down. With a bang, the dagger stabbed into its abdomen and penetrated into its abdomen. The bone-biter rat suddenly suffered great pain and struggled violently. At the same time, it let out a harsh scream. Dean gritted his teeth and used all his strength to hold the dagger, firmly nailing it to the ground. No matter how it struggled and screamed, he did not let go. Chapter 48. A panic scream came. Dean was shocked and quickly looked back. He saw Mason was surrounded by 2 bone rats and fell to the ground. Zach and Shamden watched the show. They stepped forward and punched and kicked the 2 bone rats. They didn't dare to attack with their daggers for fear of accidentally hurting Mason. Dean's face changed. He quickly pulled out his dagger and rushed over. "Fuck off!" Dean roared and kicked one of the bone-biter rats in the head with his metal boots. With a bang, the bone-biter rat's body fell backward. Zach saw the opportunity and quickly rushed forward, pressing the mouse on top of his body, raised his fist, and fiercely pounded its head. Sham grabbed the tail of the other bone rat and didn't let it climb to Mason's face. Dean had already grasped the experience of dealing with it. He bent down and pulled up the hind leg of the bone-biter mouse. He pulled it up directly, swung it hard, and smashed it on the ground. Its sharp little head hit the ground, and the strength of its struggle suddenly weakened. Dean roared and smashed it again and again. He repeatedly smashed it so that the bone rat couldn't find a point to break free from his palm. After a dozen consecutive smashes, the bone rat gradually stopped moving. Its body twitched reflexively. Blood oozed from its hair and stained the ground. At this time, Mason climbed up from the ground and cooperated with Zack to stab the other bone rat to death. Dean looked at the motionless bone rat in his hand. He grabbed his dagger and stabbed it a few times. He was relieved and sat on the ground. He felt that his arm was sore, as if it was broken. His whole body was exhausted. He was so tired that he kept gasping for breath. The air filter by the mask was very slow. It made him feel suffocated and dizzy. Mason also sat next to him. He leaned back on Dean's back and gasped for breath. Zack and Sham were in a better state. They still had a lot of physical strength. But looking at the bodies of the bone rats on the ground, they were still frightened and pale. After resting for a while, Mason patted the hair caught between the gaps of his gloves. He gasped. It was damn dangerous. It almost cut my throat. These damn things. Dean's breathing gradually became smooth. He looked back at him and said, "This time thanks to you." Mason snapped. "What are you talking about?" Dean smiled and no longer said anything. Zack said with lingering fear, "There are so many bone rats here. Didn't the hunters see them? Is it called cleaning?" Sham said, "Fortunately, our soft armor was tough and didn't get torn. Otherwise, the consequences would be unimaginable." Dean looked at the rat corpse in front of his feet and recalled his previous battle. His fingers couldn't help but clench his fists. Too bad. His performance was too bad. If Macon hadn't shouted in time, he would have been attacked by the rat from behind. "You've already done very well." After all, this is the first time you've encountered a battle like this. Even an adult would panic when they see an ordinary dog pouncing at them. While he was blaming himself, another voice in his heart was comforting him. But soon, Dean strangled this weak voice. He tightly bit his lips. The pain invaded his mind. He wanted to let his weakness remember that he only had one life. In the face of death, excellence and failure were meaningless. The only thing that could save him was the strength to live. He suddenly understood why the scavengers would only choose from the residential area and the slums, and not from the commercial area's colleges. Because the mortality rate of this job was too high, although they encountered danger this time, mainly because they came to the 8th area that had just been cleaned. If they went to the 9th area that had been scavenged 10 times, the probability of encountering these monsters would be very low. However, the low probability of danger also meant that the harvest of scavenging was low. This was a dangerous and valuable profession. This was very fair. After the previous battle experience, Dean's heart still had some fear of death. This time they encountered a rat. Would they encounter a more terrible monster next time? Should he follow the group and obediently go back after the mission is over? He looked at the broken glass door of the supermarket. His heart was filled with retreat. But soon, he thought of his right arm and the scar on it. His eyes suddenly became firm. He climbed up with his palm on the ground and said to Mason and the other two, "Go in." There was such a big movement just now. The few inside should have come out, but maybe there's still some hiding in the dark. Everyone be careful. Mason, Zack, and Sham didn't expect Dean to dare to enter the ruins. They were a little surprised. When they saw his determined eyes, they hesitated for a moment and stood up. They clenched their daggers and were ready to resist the attack. At this time, suddenly, a shrill scream came from the nearby streets. It was especially loud in the decaying ruins. Dean and the other three were surprised. They suddenly thought of the rats that they had just encountered. Hearing this shrill scream, there was no doubt that the other side had encountered something. For a time, they hesitated. They didn't know whether they should go to help or not. Dean was aware of the hesitation in his heart. He thought for a moment and said, "Go and have a look. Be careful. If there is a situation, immediately withdraw." Mason and the other two were hesitant. When they heard his words, they immediately nodded. It was as if a stone fell from their hearts. They ran toward the direction of the scream. At this time, they saw other scavengers also rushed out of other buildings and ran toward the place where the scream came from. Soon, the scream was getting closer and closer. It was a street corner. Dean immediately slowed down and made a slight gesture. Mason, Zack, and Sham immediately understood. They slowed down their pace and slowly followed behind Dean. Around the corner, Dean looked out. His pupils shrank, and his face was full of horror. He saw the center of the green vegetated street. In front of a broken shop, two figures were twisting on the ground. One was a man, and the other was a woman. However, the figure's clothes were tattered, revealing gray and thin skin. Her hair was disheveled, and her fingers had turned into sharp claws. It was an undead, a living undead. At this moment, the female undead was lying on the struggling young man's body. She was gnawing the flesh on his chest. With Dean's vision, he could see it very clearly. He could even see the blood vessels that were constantly gushing out from the young man's chest. The young man's mouth and neck were dyed red. At the young man's feet, there was a black figure. It was a woman. Her body was motionless and seemed to be dead. Chapter 49. Aaron, save me. At this time, the young man who was bitten was lying on the ground. He raised his head and raised his hand to grab the frightened young man behind him. His face was full of fear and pain, as well as the desire for life. The young man, called Aaron, covered his mouth and looked at his friend. Tears flowed down his face. His body trembled slightly. He clenched his teeth and turned back. He strode toward the exit of the street. Dean immediately saw that the undead that was biting the young man seemed to be alarmed by his footsteps. It raised its head. Its disheveled face was full of ferociousness. It suddenly abandoned the food under its body and chased after Aaron. Its running posture was extremely twisted. Its arms were waving wildly, and its body was swaying unsteadily like a drunkard who could fall at any time. However, its speed was extremely fast. In its swaying pace, it seemed to have found a strange inertia and quickly caught up with Alan. Aaron heard the movement behind him. He looked back in horror. He suddenly saw the sharp claws of the undead slanting down like a few sharp daggers. He was scared and hurriedly raised his dagger to block. Although he was able to parry the claws of the undead, he was hit by the heavy force and fell to the ground. Seeing this scene, Dean was shocked. At the same time, there was a bit of panic in his heart. If he encountered such an undead monster alone, with his current physique, he would definitely die. At the moment, there was a bit of a feeling of relief in his heart. Fortunately, he did not choose this street. Otherwise, he and Mason would be the ones to end up like this. Seeing that the young man was gradually unable to resist, Dean suddenly had the intention to retreat. The previous idea of saving people had already been thrown to the back of his mind. Although these consortium scavengers were not formal graduates, but they had participated in many scavenging activities. The number of blessings they got was far more than them. Their strength was also several times stronger than them. At the moment, they were also unable to deal with the undead. Dean turned back and waved his hand, motioning them to leave. Mason and others were standing in the back. Although they didn't see the scene inside, they heard the screams and chewing sounds. After all, the ruins were too quiet, and the sound transmission was particularly clear. At this moment, seeing Dean's gesture, their faces suddenly changed. Recalling the previous encounter with the rats, they quickly and slowly retreated. At this time, from the other side of the street, there were 4 consortium scavengers who heard the sound and strode over. They were startled when they saw Dean and the others on the other side of the street. Suddenly, they heard screams coming from the corner. The handsome youth's face changed as he rushed out and saw a horrifying scene. The youth called Alan was bitten on the arm by the undead woman. His black soft armor didn't resist the latter's sharp teeth. Blood oozed out from the bite and slid down the black armor. Undead, the handsome young man's pupils constricted. He was a little shocked, but he did not retreat. He shouted, "Hold on." Then he turned to his 3 companions and said, "Let's go together and pin it down. Wait for the others and Scott to come." The 3 companions were also horrified, but they didn't hesitate. They held their daggers and rushed toward the undead, led by the handsome young man. When the undead woman heard the sound, she looked up at them. Her blood-stained gray face revealed a ferocious expression. She roared and stood up in the same weird, twisted posture as before. She waved her arms irregularly and rushed towards the handsome youth and the others. The handsome young man roared, He jumped up and kicked the undead's chest. Bang! He kicked the undead's chest. She flew backward and fell to the ground. Dean didn't rush to leave when he saw the four of them. He went back to the corner to continue to observe. When he saw the handsome young man kick the undead, he couldn't help but be happy. However, he didn't rush to help. The undead's agility made him feel a lingering fear. Mason and the other two people saw someone coming to fight. They went behind Dean and looked. They were shocked. When the handsome young man kicked the undead, the other three people immediately came forward to drag Alan on the ground. They pulled him back and left the battlefield. At this time, the undead's body quickly climbed up. She roared hoarsely and rushed toward the handsome young man. The handsome young man was aghast. He hurriedly swung his dagger. Puff! The dagger cut into the undead woman's arm and cut into the gray skin. However, there was no blood flowing out of the skin. From the cut surface, it seemed that there was black and red flesh inside, as if the blood had solidified. This caused the undead woman's body to be extremely hard. When the dagger cut halfway, it seemed to be stuck in the bones inside. The handsome young man's pupil shrank. He held the hilt and pulled hard, but he couldn't pull it out for a while. At this time, the undead woman took advantage of this short moment to pounce on his body. She raised her other arm and clawed at his throat. With a puff sound, the claw suddenly pierced the artery on the side of his neck. Blood gushed out and splashed on the arm of the undead woman. Vickers! The three people who dragged Alan from behind ran to help. They saw this scene and cried out. The handsome young man clutched his pierced neck and widened his eyes. It seemed that he did not expect his young life to end here. He raised his head with difficulty and looked at the horrifying face in front of him. His eyes gradually dimmed. The undead growled and grabbed his body. She bit his other neck and gnawed on his body. Monster! One of the stout companions roared in grief and indignation. He held the dagger and rushed toward the undead. The undead pushed the handsome young man's body away when she heard the voice. She swayed her body and rushed toward the stout young man. Please, no, don't go. The two companions behind hurriedly shouted, but the pudgy youth's eyes had already turned red. He rushed up and stabbed with his dagger. Puff! The dagger pierced through the chest of the undead woman, who had no intention of dodging. He was startled for a moment. It seemed that he didn't expect to be killed so easily. But there was no joy in his heart. Instead, he was more sad. At this moment, the claws of the undead suddenly tore. One of the sharp claws of the index finger penetrated the cheeks of the stout middle-aged man. The tip of the claw pierced through the other cheek of the stout middle-aged man. The severe pain made the stout young man want to call out. But he was too frightened to call out. The next moment he saw the hideous face approaching him and then biting his face. Peas! One of the companions cried out in grief. The other one pulled him and hurriedly retreated. He hoped to take advantage of the time when the stout young man was eaten to escape as far as possible. Dean's face also changed color. He didn't expect that the four consortia scavengers couldn't fight against the undead. The most terrible thing was that the dagger had pierced her chest, but didn't affect her at all. Was she really an immortal monster? Suddenly, he thought of the undead woman who had died in the bathroom and the other corpses on the road. Along the way, he didn't just look for supplies. Instead, he paid more attention to these corpses. He suddenly thought that these corpses had one thing in common. That was, there were scars on their heads. Sword wounds or arrow wounds. Obviously, they were left by hunters. Chapter 50. As Dean was thinking, a lot of footsteps came from behind. He looked back and saw Scott and Mia with a large number of scavengers. Scott and Mia were running in front of the others. Their speed was extremely amazing. They were like human-shaped cheetahs. In the blink of an eye, they crossed hundreds of meters and arrived in front of Dean. What's going on? Scott asked in a hurry. Dean saw them appear. His tense heart loosened. Undead. He pointed to the corner of the street. Scott and Mia's expression changed. When they turned their heads to look, they saw the two scavengers dragging the unconscious Alan out of the street. They also saw Scott. Their sad faces were full of surprise. Help! There's an undead. Save Peas. Scott and Mia hurriedly ran over and immediately saw the scene of the undead woman gnawing the chunky young man. Their faces changed. Scott immediately pulled out his dagger and said, "Prepare to fight and kill it together. Otherwise, it will keep following the smell we left behind." At this time, Mia saw the unconscious Alan. Her pretty face turned pale. She trembled. "What's his injury?" One of them said, "He was bitten by the undead. We rushed over and saw him resisting." Scott's face changed as he heard this. He gritted his teeth. "Kill him before he's infected. Otherwise, we will have to face two undead." This. The two scavengers' faces turned ugly. They were not rookies who were scavengers. They already knew that if they were bitten by the monsters outside the giant wall, they would be infected. However, knowing was one thing, but to kill a scavenging companion with his own hands, a living person, it was really hard for him to harden his heart. "Can't we save him?" One of the tall scavengers looked at Scott. "Maybe he can hold on." "Stupid." Scott interrupted him. His face was full of anger. "If you want to die, then leave with him or kill him immediately." At this time, the other youth trembled. "The undead is coming." Scott quickly focused his attention and stared at the undead woman. He saw that she had abandoned the prey in her hands, and her green eyes fell on them. She shook her body and attacked them at an incredible speed. So fast, Scott was shocked, but he did not retreat. He gritted his teeth and charged forward. With a bang, Scott took the lead and kicked the undead woman's abdomen. The latter didn't dodge and was immediately kicked to the ground. Scott seized the opportunity and quickly approached it. Seeing that it was getting up from the ground, he immediately kicked it in the face. The tip of the steel boot hit its chin, kicking it over again. "Die!" Scott growled and raised his dagger to stab the undead woman's face. Puff! The dagger pierced through the center of the undead woman's face. The undead woman's throat issued a dry roar. Her body twitched violently. She kept twisting and struggling on the ground, but her head was nailed to the ground by Scott. After struggling for a while, she gradually stopped moving. Seeing this, Scott was relieved. He slowly pulled out the dagger from the bones of the undead's cheeks. He held the dagger tightly. When he pulled it out, the undead's head was lifted off the ground. It was as if the undead had come back to life. The two youths watching from behind were startled. Dudian saw this scene and immediately knew that his guess was right. At this time, other scavengers also rushed over. They saw several bloody corpses on the scene. Their faces became very ugly. At this time, Scott turned around and looked at the two youths. He couldn't help but angrily said, "Do you want to die? If he wakes up, the first thing he will do is to bite you." After he finished speaking, he walked up to the two of them with his bloody sword. He lowered his head and looked at Alan, who was being held by them. He took a deep breath, clenched his teeth, and stabbed his sword through Alan's throat. He twisted the sword and cut off Alan's head. Blood gushed out like a fountain. The two youths' faces were pale. Their legs were weak. They kept retreating. Scott coldly looked at them. He shook the blood off his dagger and said in a cold voice, "This is the law of survival outside the giant wall. You won't be able to learn it from the instructor. Either you adapt or you die." As he spoke, he glanced at Mia, who was standing at the side with her head lowered. He sighed and turned to the other scavengers. "Light a fire and burn the bodies here. Don't let the smell of blood attract other monsters that haven't been cleaned up." Many of these scavengers were newcomers. At the moment they saw such a cruel picture, their faces turned pale and they kept retreating. One of the short children said in horror, I want to go home. I don't want to scavenge anymore. I don't want money." Then he turned around and ran away. Scott angrily said, "Get him back for me." Two consortium scavengers immediately chased after him. At this time, one of the scavengers suddenly raised his trembling hand and pointed to the back of Scott. "Boss, they stood up." Everyone was surprised and hurried to look. Dudian immediately saw that in the shop in the distance, the young man who was bitten first and the other female scavenger next to him were struggling to sit upright. At the same time, their heads looked up at the sky as if their cervical vertebrae were fractured. Then, under everyone's gaze, their heads slowly twisted stiffly, as if the tissues inside were rapidly adapting. Damn, Scott's face was ugly. He growled, "Everyone get ready to go with me." He took the lead and rushed forward. Mia gritted her teeth and took the lead to keep up. The other consortium scavengers hesitated for a moment, but quickly caught up with them. As for the newcomers who were in the same group as Dean, they stared blankly at the scene. Some of them fell to the ground as their legs went soft. Dudian had seen Scott's skills. He estimated that Scott and Mia should be able to deal with the two transformed undeads. He immediately clenched his dagger and followed. Mason, Zack, and Sham saw Dudian rush out and quickly pulled him. "Are you crazy?" Dudian quickly said, "I'm going to destroy the other two corpses so that they won't be transformed into undeads." The three immediately said, "I'll go too." The four of them ran behind the consortium scavengers and came to the corpses. The two corpses belonged to the handsome youth and the chunky youth. Dudian looked at the corpses in front of his feet. He hesitated for a moment but clenched his teeth and used his dagger to cut their necks. After all, he had been enhanced twice. His strength was twice that of an ordinary adult. His sharp, short sword cut through their vertebrae in an instant. Dean's heart was pounding wildly. Although he knew that they were dead, he still had a sense of guilt and fear when he slashed at them. His hand, holding the dagger, trembled slightly, and he kept comforting himself in his heart. At this moment, he suddenly heard a scream of horror coming from the front. He hurriedly looked back. The dozen consortium scavengers in front, including Scott and Mia, were all horrified. They turned around and fled in their direction. Chapter 51. This so many. Dean and Mason couldn't help but be scared. At this time, Scott, who was running in the front, saw that they were still in a daze and suddenly roared, "Run!" Dean woke up and hurriedly turned around and ran. Mason, Zack, and Shaw quickly followed him. They ran like crazy. They wished they could grow 2 more legs. However, the gap between their physique and figure was finally reflected at this moment. Scott and Mia quickly passed them and ran towards the left side of the corner. They soon disappeared from the sight of Dean and the others. At this time, the other consortium scavengers also caught up. Get out of here!" A burly youth roared at Dean and others. He pushed Sham, who was the last one to fall. Puff! Sham was pushed to the side, and because of his fall, he tripped several youths who were rushing over. For a time, 4 or 5 people fell to the ground, and everyone was desperately trying to climb up. Dean heard Sham's screams and quickly stopped. He looked back and saw Sham's cheeks were bruised and fell to the ground. He had just climbed up, but another youth used his hand to press his head down. The youth stood up and quickly ran away. Hundreds of meters behind them, more than a dozen undeads were chasing them. Dean's face was pale, his fists were tightly clenched, and his heart was beating so fast that it was deafening. He fiercely clenched his teeth and ran back to the front of Sham. He grabbed his arm and shouted, "Get up!" Sham hurriedly grabbed him. Dean immediately turned and continued to run. At this time, the other consortium scavengers had already run in front of them. They followed the direction of Scott and Mia and disappeared around the corner. Sham looked back and saw more than a dozen bloodthirsty undeads behind him. His scalp tingled, his legs trembled, and he almost tripped again. At this time, Mason and Zack also turned and rushed over. They hurriedly grabbed Sham's body and dragged him forward. "Go to the right side." Soon, several people came to the corner. Dean gritted his teeth and said. Mason and the other 2 were startled, but there was no time to ask. They could only follow Dean and run to the right. At this time, Dean bit his palm and blood oozed out. He took a deep breath and grabbed a gravel from the ground. He spat the blood from his mouth and turned towards the direction where Scott, Mia, and the others had left. He threw the gravel towards the direction where Scott, Mia, and the others had left. Dong dong. The stone fell to the ground in a parabola and rolled a few times. At this time, they were already more than 30 meters away from the corner. The undead, chasing them, just came to the direction of the corner. As soon as they stepped out, they saw the stone flying in front of them. The next moment, the undead roared and chased in the direction of the stone. The few walking corpses behind it immediately followed it and chased after it. However, there was an undead among them. It seemed to be aware of Dean and the others on the right side and chased after them. Dean's face changed. He hurriedly glanced at both sides of the street. He suddenly saw more than 10 meters in front of him. There was a gate of a community. There was a small shop covered with vegetation in front of the door. He immediately said, "Come with me." He ran to the community. As soon as he ran over, he saw a few corpses lying on the ground. The security room in front of the door had long been corroded by moss. From a few exposed glass windows, he could vaguely see a humanoid shadow standing inside. Dean didn't dare to look again. He quickly stepped over the corpses on the ground and rushed to the nearest building. The security door under the building was not locked. It was slightly open. There was a corpse on the doorstep. Judging from the clothes, it was also an undead. Dean resisted the trembling in his heart. He stepped on the back of the undead and entered the back door. He looked back and said to Mason and the other two, "Come in." The three of them saw the corpse at the door. Their faces were a little pale, but they still resisted the fear and jumped over it. At this time, Dean saw that the previous undead had caught up with them, and behind it, there were two more undead. Dean's face changed. He hurriedly grabbed the door and wanted to lock it, but he found that the bolt had long been covered with moss. He immediately gave up trying to lock it. Looking back, the building was dark. There was an elevator in front of him. At the moment, the elevator door was half open. It was also covered with moss and vegetation. There were several corpses lying inside. Some were undead, and some were decayed human skeletons. The bones were dark, like rusty black iron. Dean's face was ugly. He immediately ran down the stairs and said, "Keep up." Mason and the other two quickly followed him. When Dean entered the building, he looked at the height of the building. It was at least 15 floors. He went straight up the stairs. Along the way, he saw 7 or 8 corpses, rotten human skeletons, and dog skeletons. When he ran to the 6th floor, Dean was tired and out of breath. The same was true of Mason and the other two. In fact, the previous battle with the rats had almost exhausted their physical strength. At this moment, they were completely frightened and ran away, breaking their physical limit. Roar, roar. At this time, a hoarse roar came from the bottom of the floor. The sound was approaching rapidly. Dean looked down along the staircase handrail. He suddenly saw several gray palms grabbing the handrail and climbing along the stairs. However, the climbing speed was obviously blocked. Nevertheless, seeing that they were still approaching, Dean's face became more and more ugly. He gritted his teeth and continued to climb up. Soon, Dean came to the 12th floor. He was tired and panting. He heard the unconscious roar of the undead. It was more than 10 meters below. He estimated that they should be about 3 floors away from him. He was about to continue to go up. Suddenly, Sham pointed to an open room next to him. He gasped, "Dean, we should hide in here. They should not open the door." Dean was startled. He immediately reacted and said, "Go in." He took the lead and went in. Mason and the other two immediately followed. Dean locked the door. Because of the high floor, the moss and vegetation didn't climb up, so the latch was easy to lock. Dean twisted the latch and locked it. Then he quickly glanced back at the house. He saw that the living room was very messy. There was a rotten corpse lying on the ground. There was a stroller next to it. There was a baby's corpse inside. Dean immediately said, "Move the sofa inside and block the door. Be gentle." Sofa? Macon and the others didn't understand, but when they saw the direction of Dean's finger, they understood what he was talking about. They immediately ran over. The 3 of them lifted the sofa and quickly moved it to the door. They gently put it down and put it against the door. At this time, the roar outside the door was getting clearer. Dean hurriedly made a silent gesture. He stood on the sofa and looked out through the peephole. The peephole was extremely cloudy. Dean immediately saw a few blurred figures appear from outside the door. It was the previous undead. The 3 undead seemed to climb the stairs out of inertia. They continued to climb up the stairs. Dean was relieved, but his heart was still pounding. He was only 1 door away from the bloodthirsty monster, but he felt that the world seemed to be still and only his strong heartbeat echoed in his ears. Roar! Chapter 52. Dean was scared and hurriedly pressed against the door. The door lock was old and rusty. It fell off from the door frame under the first punch of the undead. Fortunately, there was a sofa cushioning it, so it wasn't directly pushed open. Mason and the other two were scared and rushed to push the sofa. The result was that the sofa cracked from the middle. The wooden frame of the sofa had long been rotten. It couldn't withstand the gravity and suddenly turned into debris. At the same time, with a bang, the door was broken, and a gray and pale palm stretched in, grabbing randomly. Fortunately, it was an adult undead, and it was much taller than Dean, so it didn't catch Dean behind the door. Dean was pale. He forgot that the building had been corroded for 300 years and had long been dilapidated. He clenched his teeth and said to Mason and the other two, "Jump from the window and go to the next floor." Mason and the other two were panicking. But after all, they had undergone 3 years of training. They quickly responded. Mason said, "I'll help you. You go first." "Go," Dean roared. The three slightly gritted their teeth and no longer said anything. They came to the side of the window and looked down. The height of 12 floors made them feel dizzy. But at the moment, there was no retreat. Sham was the most meticulous. He glanced at the object mounted on the wall outside the balcony. He said, "We should be able to grab the balcony of the next floor if we step on it." It was an air conditioner box. Mason was the most courageous among the three. He looked at it. Although he was worried about its firmness, he clenched his teeth and took the lead to jump. Bang! The air conditioner couldn't bear his weight and suddenly collapsed. Macon was so scared that his heart stopped beating. But he was prepared for it. He hurriedly stepped on the falling air conditioner and used it to grab the balcony of the lower floor. The falling air conditioner fell vertically. After smashing several air conditioners in a row, it fell straight into the grass at the edge of the community. It made a loud noise. Mason clenched his teeth and climbed to the balcony. He looked back at Sham and Zach. They had no leverage, so they could only jump straight down. Mason shouted, "I will catch you. Sham, you jump first." Sham was the thinnest and lightest of the three. He hesitated for a moment as he looked at the open arms of Macon. He jumped down. Mason quickly grabbed Sham's body, but the inertia of the fall almost took him off the balcony. He felt a tearing pain in his arm, but he still tightly grabbed Sham, gritted his teeth, and pulled him to the balcony. Sham was still in a state of shock. He almost thought that he would die. He looked at Macon's painful face. His heart was filled with gratitude and guilt. At this time, Zach hurriedly said, "Are you ready? I'm going to jump." Mason shook his arm and said to Sham, "Let's catch him together." Sham nodded. Both of them opened their arms and said to Zach, "Jump." Zach slightly gritted his teeth and jumped down. Macon and Sham spread out their hands and immediately caught Zach. Macon's arm was in pain. He almost slipped and let go of Zach. He was scared and pale. When the three of them jumped to the balcony, Dean couldn't resist the push of the three undeads outside. The door that was once strong, but now as fragile as paper, was smashed by the three undeads. He abandoned the door. He knew that Macon and the others went to the balcony of the room. He immediately turned to the other side of the kitchen. Along the way, he lifted the table and the TV on the table to the center of the living room, tried to slow down the speed of the undeads. Although the speed of the undeads was far faster than him, but their brains didn't seem to be very good. They didn't know how to avoid. They suddenly tripped over the TV and the table on the ground. At this time, Dean seized the opportunity to run to the kitchen. He threw the kitchen knives and plates on the table at the undeads. The damage caused was minimal, but he succeeded in attracting all of them. Dean hurried to the bathroom next to the kitchen. He closed the door without any defense. He looked at the ventilation window of the toilet. It was made of aluminum alloy, but the edges had long been rotten. After 300 years of baptism, even the walls of the whole building were peeling off layers of bubble-like soil. He didn't say anything. He stepped on the toilet and lifted his foot to kick it. Bang! The window was suddenly kicked open. The narrow window was just enough to accommodate his body. If he was an adult, it would be somewhat difficult. However, when he stretched his head and looked out of the window, the height of the 12-story building, the moss-covered cars on the street, like a small steamed bun, made him dizzy. However, the roar behind him was fast approaching. Even without looking back, Dean knew that the three undeads had climbed up and rushed over. He could only jump. He gritted his teeth and jumped. There was no air conditioner on the outside wall. After all, no one would install air conditioner outside the bathroom. There were two white pipes on the smooth porcelain wall. Most of them were the pipes used for toilet excretion. Dean had already noticed it. When he jumped, he grabbed the water pipe. Bang! The water pipe was like a piece of paper. It was immediately crushed by him. The water pipe below was also pulled down by him. Dean's face changed dramatically. He hurriedly inserted his backhand. With a loud thud, the short sword in his hand stabbed into the wall and stopped his falling body. Dean's heart fell a little. When he saw that the door and the sofa were vulnerable, he thought of the previous scavenging. He saw some sword marks left on the wall by the hunters. As a result, he bet right. The wall was no longer strong, and the sword could cut a huge gap. Roar! Roar! At this time, two ferocious heads popped out of the toilet window. Two undeads were lying on the window, clawing at him. Above them, another undead rushed over. The body of the undead squeezed crazily. The wall next to the window was squeezed like mud. Looking at its crazy appearance, Dean, who had just saved his life, could not help but be shocked. His pupils suddenly shrank. He thought of a terrible possibility. He hurriedly looked down. It was only 1 meter away from the toilet window on the next floor. If there were two daggers at this time, he could easily use each other to climb to the next floor. But at this moment, there was only one dagger in his hand. Once it was pulled out, it would fall immediately. Dean gritted his teeth and looked at the windowsill more than 1 meter away from his feet. The windowsill was only half a palm wide. It was extremely difficult to jump and required great courage. However, looking at the body of the third undead that kept squeezing out, Dean did not dare to wait any longer. His body swayed slightly, and he suddenly jumped. With a whoosh, his body fell quickly, and the soles of his feet stepped on the windowsill of the toilet. However, because of the wall, the soles of his feet could not step firmly. His toes rubbed a little, and his body continued to jump down. This short distance made Dean feel as if his head had exploded in some blankness. The next moment, his palms suddenly stretched out, and, at the moment of falling, he grabbed the windowsill. At that moment, it seemed that he was alive again. Dean looked at the undeads that had squeezed out more than half of their bodies. He hurriedly raised his other hand and smashed the window. Bang! The window was immediately smashed. The glass fragments pierced his fist and blood dripped. He did not feel the pain for a while. His palm grasped the edge of the glass fragments and quickly climbed up and drilled through the window. Whoosh! Just as he drilled in, a gust of wind rolled up behind him. Dean hurriedly looked down and saw that the undeads finally squeezed out of the toilet window, fell straight down, and fell into the grass on the edge of the downstairs. At this time, because of the squeezing of the undeads, the space for the other two undeads suddenly increased. Dean immediately saw that one of the undeads was lying on the body of the other undeads, roaring and grabbing him. Dean was startled. Could it be that these undeads only knew how to attack and had no self-protection consciousness? Chapter 53. No consciousness. Dean's heart was pounding. These undeads are not the same as the rats. Although the rats are bloodthirsty, they have the consciousness of the beasts. They know how to hide, sneak attack, evade, and escape. But these undeads are different. They will only instinctively pounce on the prey. Their attack posture is completely based on instinct. There's no sense of evasion or sneak attack. It's like a killing machine, and it's an incomplete machine. Once the prey is locked, there is no other skill except for the attack command. Dean's blood was faintly boiling. He felt that he had grasped a crucial information that could keep him alive. They will only attack crazily. This is the most terrible thing about the undeads, but it's also their fatal weakness. At this time, on the other balcony, Mason, Zach, and Sham heard the sound of the window breaking. They rushed over and saw Dean standing in the toilet. They were somewhat surprised. "You? How did you come in from here?" Roar, roar. At this time, a hoarse roar came from outside the window and fell into their ears. Hearing this sound, Mason and the other two were shocked. They suddenly realized that the undeads were in the toilet above their heads. Obviously, Dean deliberately attracted them there. The reason for doing so was obviously to give the three of them time to escape. But he took the risk of jumping from the window without a foothold. These thoughts flashed in their minds for a moment. The eyes of the three suddenly turned red. What is friendship? In the most dangerous moment, they are still thinking about how to save you, even if they don't consider whether they can live or not. Although in the past 3 years of training, Dean had helped them many times. They also occasionally helped Dean. The four of them supported each other, but that was the assessment. If they failed, at most they would have to pack up and go home. But in front of them, there was a bloody, cruel, real death. Standing in front of death, they still did this. The three of them felt that their souls were trembling. They were grateful, moved, and angry because they hated themselves for being weak. Dean did not notice the emotional changes of the three people. He slightly nodded to them to show that he was safe. He looked back at the window and saw that the two undeads were still desperately struggling to squeeze out of the window. But because they could not see him, the struggle was not as fierce as before. Dean was worried that they would retreat again, so he went around the stairs. He immediately stretched out his arm and shook it gently outside the window, as if to say, "Come on, come on." The two walking dead saw the shaking arm, and their eyes suddenly turned violent. They roared and struggled madly. Bang! The walking dead suddenly broke free, and a large piece of soft concrete by the window fell down. Dean hurriedly retracted his arm to avoid being caught. Otherwise, he would have been dragged down. At this time, the last remaining undead occupied a large window and easily struggled out. It followed and fell straight down. Then there were two loud sounds, which were particularly clear in this quiet community. Dean breathed a sigh of relief and looked out of the window. He saw three undeads falling into the grass downstairs, stacked together. In vain, the undeads at the top twisted slightly and staggered to stand up again. Dean's face changed. He didn't expect that it wouldn't die from such a fall. He patted his head and forgot that this monster could only be killed by destroying its head. Falling from the height of 12 floors would only make its body a little more broken. At this time, he saw the undeads shaking their body and looked up at Dean. They opened their mouth and roared. Then they suddenly climbed to the wall. Two sharp claws fiercely clasped the wall, as if climbing a rock. A hashtag. Do you think you're Spider-Man? Dean almost vomited blood. Fortunately, he did not go upstairs, but chose to go downstairs. Otherwise, he could not stop them. Mason and the other two came to the window and looked at the fast-climbing undeads. Their faces changed. Dean did not panic. After the previous process of jumping from the 12th floor to the 11th floor, he felt as if he had died once. Later, he was aware of the weakness of these undeads. In his heart, he was no longer afraid of these undeads. "Give me the sword," Dean said coldly. Mason immediately understood what he was going to do and quickly handed him the sword. Dean held the dagger and looked at the walking dead that was climbing fast against the wall. He looked at the gray, middle-aged face approaching, but his heart no longer trembled. Instead, he became calmer. When the walking dead was half a meter away from the window, he suddenly stabbed the dagger. Puff! The dagger accurately pierced through the walking dead's eye socket and directly penetrated the soft brain tissue. The undead's body trembled. Its body seemed to suddenly lose its strength and fell down. Bang! It hit the two undeads below. The two undeads did not move. They seemed to be dead. Dean glanced at them and found that because they were in a downward posture, their heads fell to the ground, causing their skulls to crack and die on the spot. The third undeads fell on their bodies and got a body cushion, so it did not directly fall to death. At the moment, the three undeads were all solved. Dean's heart was relieved. He felt a burst of soreness in his body. From a fight with the rats until now, the continuous strenuous exercise had completely overdrawn his physical strength. He immediately sat on the toilet and looked at the three people in front of him. He gasped and smiled. "Are you hurt?" Mason shook his head and sighed. "There is no one to save us. When you are also in trouble, let us save you." Dean laughed. "Go to hell, don't curse me." After surviving a disaster, the tense nerves of several people relaxed. One by one, regardless of the dirty ground, sat on the ground to rest. "Do you think Scott and the others will be okay?" Zach said. Dean suddenly thought of his previous action of throwing stones to lead the group of undeads to them. He could not help but change his face. At that time, the situation was critical. He did not think that he would do such a thing. He thought about it carefully. Perhaps when he saw the consortium scavengers push down Sham, he was too angry and made such a move. Or perhaps the deepest part of his heart was evil. Dean shook his head slightly and no longer thought about it. He said, "Take a break and then go to find them." The faces of the three people changed. Sham suddenly said, "You say, how can there suddenly be so many undeads? Wasn't it cleaned by the hunters? Is this the so-called cleaning?" Dean slightly frowned. He also felt puzzled about this. If it was to leave the rats, he could understand. After all, in a head-on fight, the scavengers did not lose to the rats. Moreover, the rats were hiding in the sewers, so it was really difficult to kill. But these undeads were different. The strength and speed of the scavengers were not on the same level. Even if 10 people besieged one, they would suffer heavy losses, let alone leaving so many. They should have been ignored by the hunters, or they came from another area. Dean pondered. Mason and the other two people were startled and did not say anything. After a moment, Dean felt that he had enough rest. He patted the dust on his buttocks and stood up. Looking at the dagger on the wall outside the window, he was distressed. Without the dagger, it would be extremely dangerous to encounter any monsters. He thought about it and searched the room. As a result, he found that the quilts and clothes left here were all torn like pieces of paper. He suddenly saw vines crawling outside the wall. He immediately used Mason's dagger to cut off a string and twisted it into a rope. He threw it to the hilt of the dagger, nailed to the wall. After several attempts, he finally pulled the dagger out from the wall. Dean was relieved when he took back the dagger. At this time, he heard Sham's panicked voice. "Dean, come here." Dean was surprised and hurried to the windowsill where Sham was lying. He immediately saw that on the street outside the community, there were more than a dozen undeads wandering over. They did not go along the street, but turned into the community. Chapter 54. They are looking for us. Sham looked at the swaying figures and said in a creepy tone, "Do they smell us?" "Impossible, we are so far away." Dean's eyes were gloomy as he stared at the wandering figures. "They shouldn't be aware of us. Otherwise, they wouldn't move so slowly. Scott has so many people, so the smell should be much stronger than ours. Unless there are more than a dozen undeads coming from there." Mason hurriedly looked at him. "Dean, what should we do now? They're getting close to the building. If it goes on like this, they will be aware of us. Don't panic." Dean frowned as he recalled the previous events. He suddenly thought of a neglected issue. If these undeads don't have the awareness to avoid us, then they can do stupid things like jumping off a building. It shows that they don't have the concept of death. They don't realize what danger is. In that case, how can they catch prey? Scott said that they will track the smell of blood. But if that's the case, then the smell of blood from the corpses that were bitten by the undead is enough to attract all of them. Even if the corpses have been eaten, they will leave traces of blood on their mouths and hands. If other undeads are really bloodthirsty and crazy for blood, then they will inevitably bite the claws and mouth of their companions. But in fact, those undead saw us and chased us. They completely ignored the corpses on the ground. This can only show that although blood will attract them, but there is something more than blood that makes them crazier and crazier. Dean's eyes flashed with a dark luster, as if he could see through everything. Previously, the undead woman heard Alan's voice and abandoned the corpses to chase after us. I used stones to lure them away. It is likely that the thing that really attracted them was not the blood on the stones, but the sound? Dean was not happy after speculating this conclusion, but slightly frowned. He always felt that he had overlooked a very important piece of information. He continued to flip through the memories in his mind. The scenes after he came to area number 8 flashed by quickly. He saw countless corpses that had been hunted and killed. Suddenly, he was shocked. No, it was not a sound. In other words, sound was the same as blood. Although it could attract their attention, it was not what they desired the most, nor was it the main method they relied on to track their prey. The real reason was Dean and the others. That was heat. Yes, this was the main way that Dean thought of. Their main way of catching prey was to sense the heat of the prey. In short, they had thermal vision. However, it could not be called vision because some undead's eyes were pierced and some eyes were protruding. Dean guessed that their brains may have mutated into a mysterious organization that could automatically perceive the surrounding heat. Any warm-blooded animal would appear in their sensory network. Although he wasn't completely sure about this speculation, but he felt that it was the most likely one based on the current information. He looked at the undeads that were gradually approaching downstairs. Suddenly, he had an idea. He looked at Macon and the other two. Macon, you find something hard and throw it to other places. See if you can use sound to distract them. Zach, you immediately ignite a torch. The three of them were surprised, but their eyes lit up. Although they didn't know the purpose of making a torch, but using sound to distract the undeads was a good idea. Let me do it. Macon immediately ran to the room to search. He broke off a few mud-like bricks from the bedroom wall. He went to the previous kitchen and threw them toward the building. Bang! The bricks fell to the ground and turned into powder. The sound spread in the quiet neighborhood. The shaking undeads were immediately attracted to the sound. Macon was excited to see the method working. He continued to throw the torch. Moreover, he threw farther and farther away so that the undeads would be far away. Dean was relieved to see that the sound was effective. He saw that Zach was also using the fire scythe to ignite the clothes in the room to make a torch. He immediately said, "Throw the torch and see." Zach froze for a moment. He couldn't figure out what Dean was thinking, but he still listened to him and threw the torch. The flame rolled in the air and fell to the ground, almost extinguished. Dudian immediately looked closely. He saw the sound of the torch falling on the ground. Several undeads who were running behind turned back. But Macon threw the brick again, causing a huge sound. The undeads were attracted to the direction of the brick. Soon they left the community and came to the street where the brick fell. Dean suddenly felt strange. Did he guess wrong? He frowned and looked at the undeads who were attracted by the sound. He thought that it was wrong. Anyway, it was good to lead the undeads away. At this time, the distance of the stones thrown by Macon had reached the limit. The undeads wandered around the place where the stones fell. They wandered for a moment and suddenly staggered toward the neighborhood. Dean and the other three were relieved, but they suddenly widened their eyes and almost cursed out loud. What's the situation? Dean was a little surprised. They had been led away, so why were they still so persistent in drilling into this community? And looking at the direction of the undeads, they were still in this building. The only difference between this building and the other buildings was that there were 4 of them. How could this be? Sham was stunned. Sham hurriedly said, "Hurry up and continue to throw." Macon reacted and hurriedly ran to the wall to buckle the bricks and continue to throw. Soon, the wandering undeads were attracted. They were a little relieved, but their hearts were not happy. Using the sound to lure the undeads was not a long-term solution. Moreover, the time was long. Maybe the undeads from other places would be attracted. Dean frowned. What was it about them that attracted the undeads? Wait, if it is the heat, can they distinguish the difference between the heat in the body and the flame? Dean suddenly thought of this. His face slightly changed. If this was the case, there was no other way but to reduce the heat in their body. However, to reduce the heat, they could only take off their clothes. However, the nuclear radiation in the air was strong. If they took off their clothes, the radiation value would increase rapidly. Dean bowed his head in contemplation. Mason and the other 2 took turns to throw the bricks. Whenever the undead was ready to return to the community, they would throw a brick. The rhythm was very stable, and there was no random throwing. After a long while, Dean made a decision. He looked at Mason and the other two. Who is willing to go down with me and bring up an undead? Hearing this, Mason and the other two were shocked. Bring the undead up? Dead or alive? What are you doing? The three that just died. Dean seriously said, I want to dissect them. The fastest way to understand something was to see it thoroughly from the inside out. Although Dean had no medical experience and did not know much about the human body, but in such a harsh environment, there were limited ways to try. This was the only way he could think of to understand the undead as soon as possible. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.